research on other countries besides Mozambique, through mostly desktop review and some interviews. In Mozambique, we are from Mozambique. We study in Mozambique. It's much easier for us to do this kind of research, to go to the archives, to go to the libraries, to go to documentation centers, to interview the people there, go again, meet experts on the field. Some people who did research on that theme. The two important people in Mozambique who did studied academic freedom. Teresa Cruz Silva had an article published in 2011 on academic freedom in Mozambique, and also Nelson Zavala, I think he's going to present after me. It's also from Mozambique. He also has some papers published on academic freedom in Mozambique, but in the post-colonial context, right? And for the other challenge that we had actually was to think about academic research in colonial times, right? Because of the specificities of that social, political, economic conditions, right? But yeah, okay. The topic that we gave to this is academic freedom in colonial universities or universities of the African Lusophone countries between universalist claims and local constraints. What I'm going to do here, it's a very fragmented, I'm sorry. This is very formal. I thought that I would be sitting at a table with the other colleagues, in a very more horizontal space that we can discuss, things that are still, beginning to be, analyzed, synthesized, and reflecting on this. At this moment, we are doing the qualitative interviews. My colleagues are doing interviews with Cape Verdeans, scholars, academics, politicians, and I'm doing some with Mozambican scholars. So far, from Cape Verde, we interviewed Antonio Correia da Silva, which is an academic, but he was also the Ministry of Education or Higher Education in Cape Verde. We interviewed Claudio Furtado, who is also an interesting scholar, famous in the African context, in the Condesma context, in Cape Verde, even in Brazil. He wrote and he thinks a lot about the social conditions of knowledge production, about social science in the context of Cape Verde and all these things. We also did interviews with Angela Coutinho, but there is more interviews that are coming. And my colleagues in Mozambique, Marie Luan is doing also some interviews. I did some interviews also in Mozambique and Angola. They are very fresh now, and actually we are dealing with that, that data in terms of that kind of oral history in that sense, because it's also reflecting about a colonial past. And it's interesting because some of the scholars that we interviewed, they lived in that colonial condition. They studied in the colonial universities, so it's at the same time it's their personal history, but it's also people like Teresa Cruz Silva, as I said. She also studied academic freedom, so it's it's a combination of life history and intellectual interests, right? So in Angola, I did interview to Rosa Cruz Silva, who also was the Minister of Culture, the director of the National Archives in Angola. Cisaltina Abreu is also a scholar from Angola who wrote a book published by Codesre on the public. She coined this new term, public humanities, and trying to see how the humanities and the social sciences that they're entering the spaces of civil society and becoming, rescuing that kind of critical, engaged scholarship that was born after the first independence in Africa, no? Right? In Ghana, and University of Ghana, Makerere University, in Ibadan, in Zaire, in the old Zaire, and Cairo and Morocco. That the first places that they started to discuss what it is to write African history from within, right? And going against all the colonial historiography, that was racist, discriminatory, all the kinds of things. But they write this new history in a new nation for the new people, like Samora Machel used to say. I forgot what I was saying. But okay, and then some interviews for the Mozambican case, we are still dealing with the transcription now. Okay, so first thing that when I saw the call, the first thing that came to my mind is how can we do a research on the Lusophone Africa? What is this? What connects this country? Epistemically, in terms of what does make them, an epistemic unit to analyze. They are very different geographically, different natural endowments. Some has natural resources like gas, oil. Others has nothing. Some are on the sea, islands. Others are interlands. Others are completely far away from each other. One's in West Africa and others in Southern Africa. Besides the colonial, the Portuguese presence in these countries and the colonization. This is the thing that actually, the only thing that really unites them. And actually, I don't think that today we can trace something common besides that in those countries, right? But okay, the thing that we took as, to make this epistemically sensible was the fact that, they endured the colonial legacy, the Portuguese colonial legacy, especially in education. And this is very important because it's part of this work, right? The other thing that we are struggling now is how to conceptualize this project, how to conceptualize our research, especially dealing with the colonial time. We had a theater presentation here that was dealing with, current issues, that we're living now in a different different social and political and economic context, but with specific claims and demands. But on the colonial time, it's completely different to think about academic freedom. But at the same time, I think looking at the colonial time, which is unusual to talk about academic freedom, if you think about what colonialism is, it seems like an oxymoron to talk about, academic freedom in a colonial context where, just the name of colonialism implicates violence, authoritarianism, segregation, racism, all the things that really define what academic freedom is. So how can you talk about academic freedom in that kind of context where there is, a minority that comes from outside that is dominating a majority? And if you see the whole colonial strategy was to respond to that kind of question. How can a minority rule a majority? What kind of machineries, epistemologies we have to produce to be able to dominate that majority, right? So there's no base actually to talk about academic freedom in that kind of context, right? And so we are now also struggling in terms of conceptualizing our research. And I was reading a lot of literature on academic freedom. Actually, I'm also, it's a terrain that I'm also exploring for the first time. although I do work on the intellectual history, on the social conditions of knowledge production, on the history of social science research institutions in Mozambique specifically, you know. So for me, it's not so new. Of course, there's a lot of challenge. So, but I think we came after the literature review, we came across. Of course, I have to come across. I think Carlos Cardoso mentioned some scholars about doing work on academic freedom, seminal work, and I think Kwejo Apia Atua is one of them. And they have actually it's the same work that Carlos Cardoso mentioned with Klaus Beiter and Terence Karan, that they come up with this idea of the composite definition of academic freedom that I think is very important for our study. Why? Because these authors, they try to move beyond, you know, the terrains of the academia, right? And they bring this, what they call the composite definition of academic freedom, which is extramurals, which is beyond the university. And I think this is important. If you are dealing with colonial, we perceive this, that concept is very important if you are dealing with the colonial situation. You know, you have to go beyond academia, right, to understand that context. And that idea that academic freedom is also a tool for the promotion of democracy and human rights, that Atua and the others, Terence and others, you know, propose, I think it's very important for our part. And I think also the Kampala Declaration of Intellectual Freedom and Social Responsibility is also very important because they also move beyond this idea of the academic freedom to something more broad. And I don't think that it's an accident that they choose intellectual freedom instead of academic freedom. And this is important. In Mozambique, in 1 year after independence, you know, the new political power, but also with people from all over Africa, came up with the idea of establishing a Center of African Studies. And this was an interesting Center of African Studies. You know, if you see in Africa, you know, places of social science knowledge production, you know, I'm saying post-colonial Africa, in the first years of independence, it all started in West Africa. I would say North Africa too. But in terms of the discussions, the debates, historiographical debates, political debates about what is Africa and what is knowledge produced by Africa, started in West Africa, in places that I mentioned, right? Like in Ghana, in Makerere, in Ibadan. But and then that kind of hot debates, you know, that kind of aura of intellectual excitement, it started to fall down, you know, in the 70s, you know, with Kwame Nkrumah, the position, and Idi Amin took power in Ghana, you know, academic freedom, you know, restricting academic freedom in these places, you know, going, you know, putting in prison scholars, you know, Mahmoud Mandani has to leave, and many others has to leave Uganda. So the things in West Africa started to fall down, and the new place, the new hope for new academic production and intellectual freedom was Dar es Salaam. And Dar es Salaam became this hub, not just of social science production, but of transnational activism. In Dar es Salaam in the 70s, mid-70s, far, you know, it became that hub. Not just, you know, whole African great scholars were there. Jacques Depelchamp, Mahmoud Mandani, Colin Darch, but also people from abroad. Giovanna Righi was there. Walter Rodney was in Dar es Salaam. The Black Panthers in the US were in Dar es Salaam. So Dar es Salaam became that place. But and then, Nyerere is also, all that utopia of Nyerere, Ujamaa, villagizations, communal village, all that socialist utopia also started to fall down, right? There was hope, right? And they came to actually, I'm not going to the to the focuses for my paper. I'm just, that's the problem. All right. So let me talk about something about a bit. I'm going to the report now. So as I say, we are dealing with Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé in Príncipe, and Angola, right? And if you see universities in Angola, in Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe, are a post-colonial phenomenon. They did not exist in colonial times, right? You didn't have any colonial university in Cape Verde, and they started to appear very late, actually. I think in 1979 in Cape Verde, you had a school of teachers and educators for high school. They're trying to do something on a higher level, and then became in 1995 Institute of Pedagogical Studies, something like that. And the only public university was established in 2006. Imagine. And Guinea-Bissau, also the same thing. In 1978, you had the first attempts to establish something, and it was in law school. And then 2003, the first public university, Universidade Amílcar Cabral. My colleagues from Cape Verde and Angola, I think they're here. They can correct me if I'm wrong. And because this is something that we are starting doing. There is, I think in Guinea-Bissau today, we only have one public, maybe 5 private. In Cape Verde, the private university started first, then the public. In Angola, in Mozambique, there were the only exceptions. The university was established in 1962. Imagine, in 1962, most of the West African countries, not just West Africa, some of the countries like Ghana, Nigeria, Tanzania, they were starting to have Zimbabwe. They're starting to not Zimbabwe. They're starting to have their post-colonial universities, and in Mozambique, the colonial university was starting to be built. You see how these differences in colonization. So and then so we have 2 countries, 3 actually, 3 countries: Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau and São Tomé and Príncipe that did not have colonial universities. But I think that definition of ATUA opens the space to bring these discussions on liberation struggles and how the liberation struggles, Amílcar Cabral, we can say, and I think this is something that Carlos Cardoso also talks about. He might be the first African researcher in Guinea-Bissau, right? Thinking about Guinea-Bissau in African terms, started in the 50s, I think 1953, when he started working for the colonial government and going to rural areas, doing the census and, socioeconomic profiles of the population and all that kind of things. And we want to talk about academic freedom. That's the idea. It's not just academic freedom, it's intellectual freedom. And, the national liberation struggles is also a very important perspective to think about intellectual freedom. In Angola, in Mozambique, as I said, university started in 1962, but before that, in 1954, the colonial government established 2 centers of research. In Guinea-Bissau, they had before, I think in 1946, a center of studies of Guinea, of Portuguese Guinea, doing also sociological, ethnological, anthropological studies. But a foundational research institution, they were established in Angola and Mozambique in 1954. It was called Instituto de Investigação Científica de Moçambique, Instituto de Investigação Científica de Angola. They were both created in 1954 before the university. Why? Because of that question that I said, how to rule a majority, how a minority can rule a majority. They first established research centers to understand the local population, ethnologically, anthropologically, linguistically, their customs, as they used to say, their culture, having even the physical anthropology to measure the cranials and to perpetuate that idea of civilization, that ones are inferior than the others, and legitimize, colonization and all those kinds of things. So these two centers was created, and we want to see, how intellectual freedom was performed in that kind of situation. In 1962, the universities were created in Angola and Mozambique, and then in 1963, the students created the Associação Académica de Moçambique, Associação Académica de Angola, the Academic Association of Mozambique, which was a group. It's interesting. It was a group that started informally to discuss, students' issues, like books, how to print, how to photocopy books, to have a place for food for students, to have fees for transport, all these kinds, issues that are, integral to a student's life, right? But there's a book actually published, a very big book on the history of that academic association. But it's interesting when you look at that history, their complaints were not about, the colonial domination. Was not about, there's no blacks in the university. When Mozambique got independence, there were only 10 black students at university. In 1940, the illiterate rate in Mozambique was 99.9. In Guinea-Bissau was 99.7. In Angola, 99.8. In Cape Verde, I think it's a different history, because it was a place that was not, that did not have native people. People came from abroad. They came and then brought, Africans from all over Africa, and and because we are reading now, stuff on Cape Verde, on this idea of the Creole society, of the mixed people there. On the first, for instance, the first high school in all this colonial Lusophone Africa was established in Cape Verde, Liceu Gil Yanis. Actually, Amilcar Cabral studied in that high school, and I think this kind of mixed people facilitated the implementation of that kind of assimilation policy with greater intensity and visibility in Cape Verde than in the other countries. So it's not by coincidence that you had Cape Verdeans working in the other African Lusophone countries. In Mozambique, we had a lot of Cape Verdeans working for the colonial government, in the state administration. There is actually a book by a Cape Verdean who also talks about that. It's a kind of biography, and he talks about it's called A Cape Verdean in Mozambique, and Daniel Rezende Benoni Costa, and he talks about his life there. It's interesting life because he was moving in a very ambiguous space. At the same time, he was not considered by the whites from the administration, and he was very qualified, right? More than some white people working for for the colonial administration. So there was kind of racism also there in interaction with the white people. But he was also had tensions with the black population in Mozambique because they did not trust him. So his life in this kind of limbic state, being at the same time part of the colonial administration, but at the same time not being a white person, it's interesting also to deal. I don't know how many minutes I have. I apologize, but I'm not getting into the core of this presentation. But as I say, this is a fragmentary. We are still dealing with. Actually, we finished the first draft of 24 pages on the intellectual background, no, social, intellectual, political background of all these countries, right? And trying to see what connects them and what kind of ruptures we have on all these countries, right? In terms of education, social conditions, and all these kind of things, right? We wrote that part, and now we are dealing with the case studies. That's why I said that interviews now are very important for us, and we are dealing with that kind of history. I don't know how many minutes do I have, or 1 minute. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here, and maybe, yeah, just one word on the academic association of the Students Association, because of course this is very important. And actually we are looking with very careful and in a profound way that book and that history, and exploring in the interviews, people who were part of that association, because they started, as I said, like complaining about students' life. And it's interesting when you read the book, there is nothing there by the students about the black populations, about they don't have access to education, because these students were whites and mixed people mostly, and some what we called in Mozambique, and I think in most of the Lusophone African countries, assimilados, they're assimilated. I don't think that works for Cape Verde because of that kind of Creole society with mixed people. But in the other countries, in Mozambique and Angola, there was this politics of assimilation, that, you have three social groups, black people, assimilated people, and the white people, right? And to become an assimilated, you have to pass an exam. You have to know how to read. You have to know how to eat with cutlery, knife and fork. You have to dress European clothes. And the Portuguese administration will go to your house to check if you have all these conditions. And then you pay a fee, right? They check if you know how to speak Portuguese, if your children also speak, and then you pass to this group of assimilados. And then there you have more opportunities. For instance, some enter university because government paid their fees. They have a small quota for them, but very minimal, because the idea was we cannot create this mentality within the university that these people will going to turn against us. That's why you didn't have courses on law. Law was forbidden in Angola and Mozambique because most of the people were opposed to the colonial government in Portugal and in the colonies, the Democrats of Mozambique, for instance, and journal and other people, they did law, and therefore, if you put this, the natives studying law, they will go against us. So there was no law, no social science. Social science appeared in 1972 when there was time to open. And I'm sorry, I'm taking the time of my colleagues, so I'm really sorry. So I will stop here, and maybe you can discuss on the debate here.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fernandez Carlos. I believe we have questions for him, but was the oxymoron. How do you talk about academic freedom in a colonial context? That's one for us to reflect on further. All right, so the next theme is from Makerere University. Their research has the sub-theme that involves a comprehensive review of African charters, declarations, and framework related to academic freedom, with the goal of identifying gaps, inconsistencies, and areas for improvement. This research team is led by Dr. Busing J. Kabumba. So let's welcome him for this presentation.
Thank you very much, Elikpem, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm conscious that we have rather limited time, so I'll try to say as much as possible in as little time as possible. First of all, to thank ACAF and Prof for the support that enabled this work to be done. I also recognize the chair of the Makerere University Academic Staff Association, my boss who defends our academic freedom. I also recognize Ashana, a colleague from Uganda, and Dr. Stella Nyanzi, a colleague from Makerere University, a Ugandan, and a fellow struggler in the struggle for freedom in Uganda and elsewhere. Now, I know there's a session on gender afterwards with Stella and colleagues, but it's part of the challenge that we have to think through. Makerere began, and I was interested to see that the very first quotation that began these proceedings in the morning was a quote from Mahmoud Mamdani of Makerere, but also a protagonist with Stella, so it's an interesting dynamic there. But he talked about the impossibility of being able to have a real university if people cannot think. And Dr. Fernandez, of course, also pointed out the irony of the possibility of having thought in a colonial context. And it was the same in Uganda. Makerere began in 1922 as a vocational institution. It was never intended to be more than that. It was basically for people to carpenters, etc. And there was also a gender dynamic, because one of the earliest mottos of Makerere was, first, let us be men. And so in essence, it was rooted in all the isms of the time, racism, patriarchy, and all these challenges. And in fact, law only began after independence. Now, our task as Makerere, the Human Rights and Peace Center, was to examine the existing documents, declarations in Africa, and we evidently from the discussion today, all of us in this room are acquainted with those documents, Dar es Salaam, Kampala, and the Dar Annex. But it was really to look at them, and apologies if my voice is a little bit high. I'm still recovering from the ears from the landing, so I don't quite know how I'm projecting. You'll bear with me if I'm too low or too high. But the question was, look at those documents and see the inconsistencies, if there are any gaps in those documents, if those documents go beyond international law, which is a good thing, and try to see whether they can be improved, if at all. And in fact, we're calling our draft report, which is about 82 pages, and which I'm going to condense now, we're calling it the case for a new African declaration on academic freedom in institutions of higher education. And I'll explain later why that focus is made. But just to say that certainly there's language in general international law that provides for freedom of expression broadly, which of course has been interpreted to include academic freedom and other freedoms, whether it's assembly, the right to form a joint trade unions, etc. So you can talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you can talk about the ICCPR, the ICISA of 1966. So there was a certain broad framework under general international law which could be co-opted. So I'm starting with a broad brush of relevant international law as a basis, as a comparator for the African documents. So beyond those more general international law frameworks, we have a specific 1997 UNESCO recommendation concerning the status of higher education teaching personnel. And that really focuses on higher education. And really, maybe let me begin with the end. Our suggestion at the end is really that perhaps we need to focus first on higher education. I know there are questions around that. There are discussions about the breadth and scopes evident in the Kampala Declaration, Dar es Salaam, a need to include. But perhaps there's a danger in overbreadth, especially this time, since there are so many questions even around what academic freedom means in higher education institutions. There are a lot of things still to be understood there. So our suggestion, really, at the end of the day, is that we must, at this moment, first focus on higher education. And so I explain. So the 1997 document, the UNESCO document, really does that. It focuses on academic freedom in higher education institutions, and it looks at it in both as an individual issue, but also as a collective matter. It talks about academic freedom, but also, very importantly, it talks about institutional autonomy. The right, of course, to teach without interference, the questions around access to education. But the only responsibility, and this is another concern in the course of the study, our concern is that the existing documents, the existing African documents, have language around responsibility that is potentially problematic and perhaps actually inconsistent with academic freedom. It has language that, by its very nature, by the references to social responsibility, and however well-meaning, actually even references to the duty to support gender movements or the duty to resist racism, we suggest that part of that language, however well-intentioned, part of those ideas around responsibilities are problematic. So in the UNESCO declaration, the only responsibility mentioned is a fair treatment of competing views. That's the responsibility an academic has. And to respect the academic freedom of others, to be honest in one's research, to be evidence-based, to have a commitment to scholarly integrity. It seems to our team that that's really what one can say. Perhaps in a modest sense, that maybe is the responsibility of an academic. We suspect that it might be asking for too much and perhaps also being contradictory to sort of direct academics into particular paths. Because is it freedom? We got an email from Prof and his team suggesting very strongly that we must wear African attire for today's opening ceremony. And the rebel in me said, for that reason, I'm going to put on this. It's a gentle guide, and of course the email said this is voluntary. But isn't freedom precisely the idea of freedom? Isn't freedom the right to be free, to be independent, to pursue thoughts, however terrible, however subversive they might be? What is freedom if not to do such things? Is it freedom to say the things that the society is comfortable with? Is that really freedom? The UN Draft Principles for Implementation of the Right to Academic Freedom 2024 similarly emphasize, and there are 9 principles, and they're quite important. Those suggest that it should be for all levels of education. Now, part of our concern with expanding the breadth of academic freedom as such is that it's not quite consistent with the roots of the idea of academic freedom. And just for avoidance of doubt, we're not saying that students in primary school or that teachers in secondary schools don't have rights to expression. They do. But rather it suggests that academic freedom is a particular kind of right. Now, I'll explain that shortly. But there's also the idea that there's something about age. That in a higher education institution, you're dealing with learners who are adults. And perhaps you can be trusted to deal with views that are controversial. That may not be the same for a 5-year-old child, a 10-year-old child. So maybe there are different responsibilities of a teacher in that setting. Maybe maybe in that setting you can talk about responsibilities to guide them in a particular direction, consistent, maybe even with their parents' views. Maybe. For a person in a higher education institution, the commitment really, actually the idea is to shake you up, try to make you uncomfortable, to try to instill in you the tools for independent inquiry, which might include, with a Socratic method, pushing back perhaps even unsettling, disquieting the learner. Now, do we want to be unsettling and disquieting teenager, kindergarten, you know? Maybe not. And so that's one area perhaps where this special kind of freedom, this unique kind of freedom might best be restricted or articulated for higher education institutions. But there's also the question around the uniqueness of this freedom as being derived from the idea of expertise. That you get a special protection because you have taken time to study the area, and that therefore, beyond the general freedom of expression, you have a particular protection that is rooted in that expertise. And is also rooted in your special role as a seeker of truth, who generates knowledge, who generates new knowledge. And that society permits you to do that, even in subversive ways, because we cannot know beforehand what is the truth. So because of your expertise and your commitment to the generation of knowledge, academic freedom is specially protected. That may not be the case in kindergarten or primary school, where, in a sense, you have a textbook and you read from it, and basically the lesson stops and starts there. Now, of course, I suspect there might be pushback around, again, coloniality that is in this gatekeeping. But that is not inconsistent with African forms of knowledge production. In fact, there were also ways of determining who got the right to special speech based on age, based on expertise. So it is not really necessarily gatekeeping. It's just to say that maybe this idea of academic freedom is unique in its history, in its purpose, in its foundation, and that maybe we need to think about it first, in more fundamental in terms of higher education institutions. So the UN draft principles of 2024 talk about all levels of education, but we would suggest in our report that the UNESCO approach perhaps is a better one. There are many others. There's in Europe, in terms of best practices, you have the Magna Charta Universitam Declaration of 1988 and 2020, which also emphasize autonomy. They talk about, they also have some language that suggests that reads like Dar es Salaam and Kampala, the duty to engage with the needs of the world. Even that's the 2020, the duty is to engage with a little bit suspect language there. You have the Council of Europe and the Committee of Ministerial Recommendations from 2006-2012, reports that were adopted by Parliament, resolutions 2006 and 2012, which locate the freedom, academic freedom, in the freedom of expression, but again, very importantly, read it alongside institutional autonomy. You have the EU Charter on Fundamental Rights, unique in terms of treaties, for specifically providing for academic freedom in its Article 13. And you have the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 10, that talks about expression generally, but also that has been interpreted in the case law of the European Court of Human Rights to include academic freedom. I'll just quickly cite in passing 4 cases, Soguk versus Turkey, that emphasize the importance of academic freedom, of expression, including disruptive knowledge. And really for us, that's the critical thing. Disruptive knowledge, not knowledge that is consistent with the norm, but knowledge that challenges accepted truth. That was Soguk versus Turkey. Lombardi versus Italy talks about academic freedom as an element of freedom of expression, and that in that particular case, the refusal to renew a lecturer's contract based on his supposed views against Catholic doctrine was held to be a disproportionate interference. Of course, there's also the question around private universities. But our suggestion is that this should also apply to private universities. Sapan versus Turkey was an interesting case where a gentleman wrote an article based on stars, basically on stardom, and the court felt that, again, the point was, it was not mere gossip about private life. And why the court determined that it was beyond mere gossip is because the applicant was an academic who had done his doctorate in this area and was not just writing, therefore, for mere amusement or for, So that really, there's something unique about academic freedom that protects in a special way based on time, expertise, and the idea that someone has dedicated their life to this particular issue. Mustafa and others versus Turkey, the last case I'll cite from there. There again, the writing of this particular person, insofar as was based on academic expertise and addressing issues of public importance, was held to be protected. What's important about that case is the court's finding that, and this is the point Dr. Fernandez made, that it covers extramural expression. So that the freedom of expression doesn't, academic freedom doesn't just include the areas of your expertise or the classroom setting, but it also goes to commentary outside the class and importantly, outside the scope of your expertise. Now that sounds like a contradiction in terms because you said it seems academic freedom is linked to your expertise. But it seems from the jurisprudence that because your expertise in one thing, it's really about the method, that you have committed yourself to a method of inquiry, that you're allowed to pontificate about other issues that may be perhaps broadly related to your method. Okay. Very quickly, in terms of the inter-American system, what's unique there is that you have the 2021 Principles on Academic Freedom, adopted by the American Commission on Human Rights. But there, what's critical about them is the appreciation of academic freedom as a standalone right. Now, because most of the jurisprudence from the European Court and elsewhere looks at it as an element of freedom of expression. The Inter-American Principles look at it as a standalone right, an intrinsic right in it that actually then is of value in achieving other rights. That academic freedom, because one way is to say you have academic freedom based on a broad reading of other rights, including the rights to liberty, association, etc. But the suggestion here is that academic freedom in itself is important as such, and it's critical to the achievement of many other rights, including, again, the right to education, the rights to equality, etc. And that it's a foundation for democracy, pluralism, scientific inquiry. All of this, again, is important for our discussion around the challenges around the African documents. Now, there are quite a number of other documents. The 1915 and 1940 Declaration of Principles in Academic Freedom and Academic Tenure from the American Association of Universities, the 1988 Lima Declaration on Academic Freedom. What's interesting about those is that they understand freedom as not just being for lecturers or people with tenure, but even those who are on probationary terms, but also students and other persons involved in the academic project, including administrators, which is also important. Now, again, it sounds like a contradiction in terms. We say that academic freedom is derived from the expertise, but insofar as these groups of persons are intricately linked in the process of generating knowledge, the principle still holds that therefore academic freedom in an issue of higher learning necessarily involves those who are on permanent terms. It involves the students who are involved in an iterative process of exchange with the lecturers, with the facilitator, and then it also involves those who make the work possible. I'll cite the 2004 also, lastly, the 2004 Amman Declaration on Academic Freedom and the Independence of Institutions of Higher Education and Scientific Research, is a bit of a mouthful, adopted by Arab academics. And again there, it was underscored that to talk about independence of professors, students, and even administrative personnel. And also, it was emphasized that you're talking about autonomy as a value. So 80% of the work is done because that is a broad rubric of what exists both under the international binding on many of our states, but also in terms of what others are doing elsewhere and the thought process going on in other systems. Now, in the African sense, we have the Article 17, which talks about the right to education and which has been interpreted by the African Commission to include academic freedom. That's in the 2010 Principles and Guidelines on the implementation of ECOSOC rights. And then you have the whole range of rights in the African Charter that can be read to include or to broadly provide for academic freedom. The jurisprudence is the Serra case, where it was held that you can read the right to food into it. So we know from the jurisprudence of the African Commission that you don't need to see the word academic freedom in the African Charter for that right to exist. There have been two cases before the African Commission that have touched on this. The first was European Alliance for Human Rights versus Egypt. That was brought, it was in the post-coup moment, a number of people killed, 174 students killed. 1,300 plus detained, number of professors killed. Unfortunately, it was dismissed for want of prosecution. So the other case we have from the African Commission is Good versus Botswana. A gentleman who was deported from Botswana for saying bad things about the president. He had written an article commenting on presidential succession. Again, unfortunately, that particular case treats it as a freedom of expression issue. Good had himself specifically invoked academic freedom, but it was not quite dealt with in those terms. But nonetheless, the court, there's some language there that allows us to talk about, because it says it includes the freedom to say provocative things, and that in particular, when you're talking about political speech, there should be a higher tolerance for that. Now, when we come to African state practice, we have a January 2024 communique between a joint communique with AU and EU on this matter, affirming the academic freedom, the idea that academic freedom exists as part of freedom of expression. In the South African, the SADC, you also have a protocol on education and training, which specifically includes academic freedom, Article 2G. So you have normative developments in terms of hard law in the African system that suggest that this is an evolving, not even just evolving, something that can be invoked before courts or tribunals. At least 15 African countries specifically mention academic freedom in their constitutions. South Sudan, Sudan, the Gambia, South Africa, Uganda, Malawi, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Namibia, and others. That's also a very, in terms of international law, you can talk about its element. If you are making the case for the development of customary international law around the question of academic freedom, that will be evidence for it in terms of state practice and opinio iuri. The decisions of courts are mixed. You have some Kenyan decisions which are quite affirmative. The case of Republic versus Cabinet Secretary, ex parte, the Kenyan University Staff Union, which really was very strong jurisprudence on academic freedom, saying it includes the right to teach and to circulate even views that may be disquieting to others. On the other hand, you have a case from Uganda in which I was one of the petitioners, Honorable Fox Odoy and 21 others. It came out 2023. And there, unfortunately, you had the Constitutional Court saying that academic freedom is restricted to areas of your expertise. Very unfortunate decision. And worse, the court says it's also restricted geographically to the university. I mean, you can't think of any more ridiculous idea that it's restricted to your expertise and restricted in geographical terms. So once you get out of the gate, somehow you lose, your status as academic, and the right to freedom is very strange. So when it comes to the declarations, it seems they have a certain political context that are made at a particular time that informs their language and perhaps also then explains some of their limitations. They have strengths, obviously. The Dar es Salaam Declaration that started is strong in terms of its recognition of the importance of students as part of the academic community, the institutional autonomy and the individual freedom and collective rights. It's strong there. But again, as you suggested, the language around, it's evidently rooted in its time. The duty, it talks about the duty of scholars. Education is for emancipation. You must fulfill rights. It must be, there's a social responsibility to contribute towards redressing historical and contemporary inequities. You must dedicate voluntary time to impart education to disadvantaged. Now, all these are noble things. But anything that suggests that you must do something is language, and we know it, again, we know it from the experience of the African Commission, that there's a case in which a Tanzanian judge says we must always remember that it's the fundamental right that's important and not the restrictions. Our fear as the Macaire team is that when you fill a document on academic freedom with duties and responsibilities, the focus on freedom might be lost and new dangers against that freedom through benign language like responsibilities emerge. And we know from our African states that any excuse can be latched on to prescribe rights. It's the same challenge with the Kampala Declaration of the same year. Again, very strong in terms of recognizing the importance of freedom, proscribing military intervention, etc. But the language of social responsibility remains problematic. And then we come to the 2025 document. I fear that the elephant in the room, the ghost that was haunting the discussions there, with due respect to anyone who might have been involved, I fear that Trump, the specter of Trump was, there's language there that seems to really be directed at him or the moment that we're in. Of course, it's an important and scary moment in some ways. But the language there, of course, it repeats the language of the Kampala Declaration, but it talks about the idea of contesting misogyny, misogynist ideologies, distancing yourselves from far-right ideologies propagated by some Western academics in social media and CSOs. Responsibility to study and understand conditions that cause geopolitical upheavals. War and peace. Resist the commodification private. Now, dominance. Again, this language sounds not only benign, but in fact it also sounds noble, and perhaps it sounds good. But again, a freedom, in a document talking about freedom, the idea that you're dictating at the beginning a consensus, you're controlling consent, you're manufacturing consent, to quote Noam Chomsky, that's it. You're creating consensus and foisting it upon, and that really is problematic from a point of view of academic freedom. So, based on those considerations, Prof and colleagues in this room, the team has drafted 19 principles. I'll not go into the details of those principles. But the draft is called a Draft African Declaration on Academic Freedom in Institutions of Higher Education. The first article recognizes academic freedom as a freestanding human right, a standalone right, not as derived from expression. It talks about the scope of this right, Article 2, as including teachers, researchers, students, and administrative staff, both in public and private universities. Article 3 would suggest the core elements of that right to teach, disseminate research, etc. Article 4 would describe institutional autonomy and accountability. Article 5 would insist on non-discrimination. So it is not the duty to do things, to achieve certain things, but to be fair. And Article 6, that talks about duties, would restrict the duties to only respecting the freedom of others, to maintain scholarly and ethical standards and inquiry, and not to incite harm, which seems to be consistent with existing international law on the subject. Then we have suggested a part 2 that talks about related freedoms, because of course, from Human Rights Law, 1993 Vienna Declaration, human rights are interrelated. So we have Article 7, freedom of expression, Article 8, freedom of assemblies, Article 9, security of tenure, Article 10 will be freedom of movement, Article 11 will be privacy and digital freedom, which is not to take away from this freestanding nature of the right, but of course to acknowledge that the rights have to be read together. We would then suggest a part 3 with obligations of the state, Article 12 being to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights, which is a standard articulation. Article 13 to stop, to prevent violence, protection from violence and militarism, which is a challenge. Article 14 will be about funding and accountability by the state, but not for that funding to then have be accompanied by a duty to think in a particular way. Article 15 would have remedies, and we have the language of where I've suggested. I'm just giving you sort of an overview. Part 4 talks about responsibilities of institutions and academics, and again, institutionally it's restricted to uphold ethics, transparency, and to have mechanisms of prevention of discrimination. So the idea of directing scholars into a particular it is just to have a level ground, follow ideas. The idea being that a bad idea can be talked through and challenged through research and dialogue. But you don't force an entire room that go and resist, because how do we know before the fact what is tyranny and what is truth? And we have Article 17 that talks about, again, professional and ethical conditions, honesty, declaration of conflicts of interest, integrity, respect for the method. And finally, Part 5 will talk about cooperation. Article 18 will talk about monitoring cooperation, and Article 19 will talk about international solidarity. But in sum, what we identify as being a core element of the existing normative framework is the idea of the importance of this as a standalone right. As a standalone right, not derivative from freedom of expression. The importance of institutional autonomy. And perhaps the suggestion from us that it should not be, that for now, let's think really about perhaps higher education as such in a normative sense, because to expand it introduces new challenges, etc. And finally, is to simply suggest that if you're in a higher education setting, we can trust adults to be adults. We can trust the learners to be able to handle difficult conversations. So what if someone suggests that black people are somehow innately inferior? You respond with facts and evidence, they counter view. So that we don't have anything to fear from Andrew Tate or Donald Trump or anyone else in that. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you, Dr. Kabumba. Thank you for that comprehensive review. Okay, so we had a third presentation, but unfortunately, Professor Nelson wasn't able to join us. Professor Nelson Zavale also from Eduardo Mondlane University. Due to some challenges, he wasn't able to join us today. So that means we have some more time for questions and then answers. So now we will open the floor for questions. So we would take about 3 questions and then the responses, and then the next batch, 3 questions and then responses. All right. Questions? Presenters, yes. Please, you can have a seat at the front. Yeah. Questions?
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Baharu Zode. I'm from Addis Ababa University. Just comments on both presentations. The first one by the team Fernandez. I'm sure you are aware of it. I wish you were more organized in your presentation, because we haven't really got much in terms of really what kind of methodology you are going to use. In fact, even who the other members of the team are, which is really, as a matter of courtesy, if it is a teamwork, at least one has to mention at least the other members of the team. This applies also to the Makarere. I didn't hear it. No, sorry. And so exactly, and because you highlighted some high-profile informants that you interviewed, but of course, in this kind of study, I think one has to do a more comprehensive, more systematic approach, in terms of broadening the base. And what are the findings at the moment, and what stage is the research in? These are some of the basic questions that one would like to get from this kind of exercise. Of course, we didn't hear the third one, but I was amazed that 2 teams are based in Mozambique. So exactly what's the background for this? Because I mean, in the past, the Lusophone countries were underrepresented. Now we seem to have we seem to have a case of over-representation. I don't know what topic they were given. If it is the same Lusophone countries, then I think there is a kind of imbalance. Even from inception, the research product has a flaw. I was flawed. With regard to the Makarere team, which is much more organized, although again, you failed to mention the names of the other members. But you know, the Tanzanian declaration, recently, I think about a year ago or even less, there was a conference on academic freedom in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam. Yeah, you remember, yes? And so it would be interesting to find out exactly, because it may have been a case of reviewing or assessing where we are. So I don't know if you are familiar with that. Maybe you could really explore what were the themes that were discussed and what are the final resolutions and so on, because that would probably give a better idea. But the one thing that I find a bit I'm skeptical about is you are very much critical of the social responsibility appendage. Anyway, freedom always comes with responsibility. Press freedom is a very good example. You can't have just absolute press freedom. You have to be responsible, accountable, and so on. So I think, and particularly in a kind of authoritarian setting in Africa where we have, I think it makes it more palatable to align academic freedom with social responsibility than to say freedom at all costs kind of thing. So I think maybe you may have to temper your critique of this social responsibility. And also, I think you mentioned it, but at least you have to emphasize the alliance with institutional autonomy. Academic freedom and institutional autonomy are very much two interrelated things. So that is probably one line of investigation that we'll explore further. And institutional autonomy means not autonomy only at the higher level, but cascaded down to the lowest administrative units. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, the next. Yeah.
Yeah.
Kindly introduce yourself first.
Yeah, I am Dr. Brian Magebe. I'm coming from Sierra Leone. I need to thank Professor, who happens to be the regional coordinator. I don't know if he's around. Is Prof around? Yeah, I really want to hug him, please. I want to hug him because it's like we are victim, we are somewhere, we are, it's like we are not alone in this whole academic struggle. We need to appreciate him. Ladies and gentlemen, can we please clap for our Prof? You see, I've been the president, Academic Staff Association of my university, and also the president, Union of Academic Staff, Sierra Leone chapter. I know what it means when you talk about academic freedom. We'll come to that probably tomorrow when individual countries will be presenting on their state of academic freedom. To be frank with you, with Dr. Fernandez, I was a bit disturbed. If you want to talk about colonial effect on academic freedom, please don't forget about my country, Sierra Leone, because the first university was established in 1827. Ghana can testify that. And the essence of those establishments is just to satisfy the colonial masters. Yeah, that is all the essence. You take one individual of your interest from one country, you bring it to the other country, you skew their minds in their interests. But that's not what really, to me, we are here for. Sierra Leone got independence 1961. So we are along the line for 64 years. What have we been doing as black Africans? I hope, in fact, the colonial mentality was never initiated from black Africans. If it would have been generated from them, trust me, the black race would have been extinct. Trust. Let me get back before I come and ask him to Sierra Leone. The system of education. We have the Vice Chancellor who is being approved by Tertiary Education Commission, and the TSC is directly answerable to the minister. The minister has to recommend 2 people to the president, and the president has to approve who is to be the VC of that institution. That already has created room for the leadership of university not to be independent. The 2 things to us affecting academic freedom is, 1, dishonesty among us here sitting as academics. And that one was manifested by Mr. Switzerland in the skit that was presented, is an example. And also another category, the politicians. Obviously, when you look at Sierra Leone, all heads of academic institutions are academics. But the other entity, the political arena, obviously has to influence them to do something contrary. So we should focus on ourselves from within, how sincere, even with your PhD you are, or being a professor. That's why I said we need to commend our prof, who happens to be our brother. There is an advert for a drink, stout. If you get to that, they said, it says, power is from within. When the leadership of the Academic Staff Association is fragile, when you have mediocres who may not trust themselves, when you have people who are dishonest, obviously you will not experience the academic freedom we are talking about, even if you look at the entire review as presented by our brother Fernandez. So to me, colonial rule has nothing. We need to check ourselves now and see what being academic is one. Two, how sincere are you to ensure that the academic freedom holds? You begin to check ourselves individually. So my question back to my brother there. So as I rightly said, don't forget to insert Sierra Leone in terms of history. Though you are looking out for Portuguese states, but in terms of West Africa and Sub-Saharan, you check, you can see that Sierra Leone was the first country established university. But do critical analysis to see where we are today. What is the effect of colonial rule on the concept of academic freedom? The Rastafarians are crying for slavery every day. That's not the solution. The solution here as Africans, what mentality have you got to ensure that the politicians will not influence the issue of academic? That the freedom of expression must exist to ensure that the good things, because it's only that will encourage democracy. So my question back to you is that, what is the effect of colonial rule on the concept of academic freedom in the 21st century look at the post-colonial era. Take the case study of Ghana and Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is 64 years along the line. What have you done to ensure that students have the space to exist, to ensure that there is academic freedom, even for colleagues? Believe in me, Africans, even in the area of supervision, they will use that as an instrument for other colleagues not to grow, and use it to even intimidate, to skew their mind, to subdue themselves in the schools and faculties where they exist. So let us leave colonial in this aspect and check ourselves. The other aspect in the second presenter, my question really goes to you directly. The way you are creating the articles in the definition of freedom, I think you are giving space to politicians. You skew so much that you are trying to say the definition of academic freedom should be based on principles, or institution of higher learning, and then you generate those articles. Remember also, the politicians are academic. And the threats to academic freedom are politicians and colleagues that are within, the scholars also that are within academia. Remember that the typical example is now we're having the vice president of Ghana. He has been in the academic arena. As such, he has respect for academics. So she knows everything, what to do, how to escape, how you suppress. If such individual has interest in suppressing scholars, I am telling you, she will be there in the next 2 days. So these are the things we begin to look at. So, but the flexibility, the articles you've created in the area of I am a statistician, I believe in results. 2 more protocol you've created, trust me, we have the lacuna or even space for politicians to easily come in and suppress scholars and along the line, scholars will be a victim. Why are you skewing the definition of academic freedom? Thank you.
Thank you. The last question, and then we'll have a response from our researchers.
Bien. Bonjour, chers tous. C'est un autre son de cloche. Je suis francophone. Je suis le professeur Mathurin Ovono Ebe de l'université Omar Bongo du Gabon. Je pense que ce n'est pas une question que je vais poser ici. C'est plutôt une contribution et je vais dans le sens du collègue qui vient d'intervenir pour revenir sur l'aspect historique, non pas nécessairement sur la colonisation, mais sur les lendemains de la colonisation. Au Gabon, par exemple, l'Université nationale du Gabon, qui est devenue Université Omar Bongo en 1978, est née non pas par la volonté de créer une université, mais par la volonté de caserner les opposants. L'Université nationale du Gabon naît au lendemain de mai 1968 en France. Et il s'avère que parmi les étudiants de mai 68, il y avait une forte délégation gabonaise. Et lorsque la France veut se débarrasser de ces étudiants africains, ils appellent les États. Et le Gabon, qui n'était pas préparé à ouvrir une université, s'est précipité d'en ouvrir une uniquement pour caser ces récalcitrants étudiants. Et de la façon dont ils ont casé les récalcitrants étudiants, de cette façon, ils ont casé les enseignants parce qu'on enseignait à l'Université nationale du Gabon selon, on va dire, la conception du régime à l'époque, n'enseignait à l'université que des opposants. Donc, on a ouvert une université aussi bien pour caser des récalcitrants étudiants que pour caser des enseignants taxés d'opposants. À ce moment-là, se pose le problème de la liberté académique. Donc, la liberté académique au Gabon a une origine, celle qui consistait à caser des opposants. Et c'est pour cela que, tout au long de l'histoire de l'enseignement supérieur au Gabon, le régime aura une influence forte sur la psychologie des enseignants. Et c'est pour cela qu'à partir de 1981, lors de la grande grève des enseignants, le régime a fermé certains départements. Le département de sociologie, par exemple, avait été fermé à l'université Omar Bongo et les enseignants avaient été affectés non pas dans les autres universités, mais dans les collèges, pour enseigner le français en sixième, par exemple, la sixième en troisième. Voyez-vous? Donc, il y a nécessairement cet impact de l'histoire et qui est nécessairement lié à celle du colon. Parce que, qu'est-ce que nous avons au lendemain des indépendances? Nous avons des présidents qui sont en fait des sous-préfets des anciens colons et qui vont dans le prolongement même de la colonisation. Mais ce que l'enseignant-chercheur actuellement africain doit faire, c'est se départir effectivement, psychologiquement, de cette emprise du politique. Or, nous voyons que ce qu'on perd, ce qu'on gagne d'un côté, on le perd de l'autre. Progressivement, les universités deviennent indépendantes, autonomes, mais malheureusement, nous-mêmes, nous entrons dans l'emprisonnement de nos propres libertés. C'est pour cela que, parce que nous cherchons des postes de nomination, le plus souvent, et le cas est plus patent malheureusement, dans la zone francophone. Parce que nous cherchons des postes de nomination politique, nous devenons nous-mêmes nos propres bourreaux. Ce qui se passe, c'est que le plus souvent, les ministres de l'enseignement supérieur dans les pays francophones sont issus du monde universitaire et ils sont les premiers même à enfreindre aux libertés académiques dans l'enseignement supérieur. Et c'est grave. Donc, je soutiens la position du collègue qui nous appelle, qui nous interpelle. Il faudrait que psychologiquement nous nous débarrassions de cette posture qui est née au lendemain des indépendances. Voilà le combat que nous devons mener et il ne faut jamais se fatiguer pour mener ce combat parce qu'à terme, liberté académique doit rimer avec autonomie des universités. Merci.
Merci. All right, so we take answers from my research teams.
Best part, this is the part that I loved in academia. After presentations, the debate, tensions, contradictions, dissent, disagreements, and intersubjective knowledge production. And this is what really matters in academia. So I will start with the colleague there. Actually, I didn't want to go into all these details. Actually, Appiah has a nice typology for understanding African universities in one of his articles. And he says, the first ones was the missionary-led institutions, and Fort Bear College in 1827 is one of them. The second is the settler colonial universities. Cape Town University, Pretoria University, Stellenbosch University are in that kind of second group. Cape UCT in 1829, Stellenbosch in 1903. And then you have the third group of universities founded in the independent Africa. I focus on these ones because it was there that, that vibrant intellectual history, discussing history from within, the colonial perspective on African history. This is there's the fourth and last group of universities that emerged during late colonial period. And the Lusophone countries are part of that group. So I could go there. The gentleman there, I think I don't know if I mentioned my colleagues. I even said that one of them is doing music. Is not working, I don't know if anyone heard, he's not working on academia. His PhD is on ethnomusicology. And also mentioned the other colleague, Diana, I even said the name, Diana Gilovisa. And she's a master's student in sociology. Yeah. Theoretical findings. I think the most interesting part of this, methodology. This is a research based on archival work. I mentioned that I went to the archives, Mozambique National Archive, the Documentation Center, libraries, and it's also based on desktop review, going to the journals database, JSTOR, Scopus, Taylor and Francis, and all of the, And it's also based on the qualitative interviews, we have a semi-structured guide, some research questions, and then we have interviews by Zoom in Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, São Tomé, and Mozambique. I said that I'm doing in Mozambique. I'm focusing in Mozambique. My colleague is I'm focused in Mozambique and Angola. My colleague, I think I mentioned that, so I'm not going to. Findings. I think the most important thing for me now is the theoretical finding of this research. In the beginning, as I said, when I heard about academic freedom in colonial times, I said, what is this? colonial time was violence, discrimination, racism. But I think the good thing about this research is that is in unpacking this concept of first making the distinction between academic freedom and intellectual freedom. And I think we have to make that distinction. And the legacy of liberation struggles will help us to make and deepen that distinction. Because, and you know, they move beyond that. You know, I don't know if you know CONCP, the Conference of the African Lusophone countries that founded in the 50s, I think 50s or 40s, you know, in Algeria or Morocco. That legacy, we need to bring it today because they fought about intellectual fights in transnational ways, extramurals, going beyond university. And that is it's a good, I think, theoretical finding for this project to explore the legacies of national liberations. Because when I talk about the Mozambique Academic Association, founded in 1963 during colonial time, progressively they became aware of the struggles that they were in. And they understood that academic freedom is not just fighting within the murals of the academia. They knew and they started to listen to the guerrilla radios, to clandestine cells, that there is a fight outside the centers of the knowledge production, which was the cities. And there was a brainwash to all these people who were studying at universities. You know, the Frelimo freedom fighters, they were called terrorists. And, you know, within universities, there was the PID, the secret police, the political police of Portuguese, controlling all of them. Even in Cape Verde, that was more open in terms of education, you know, high schools and all these things. There was not just physical surveillance, but ideological surveillance to them. So they realized, these academic students, that we need to go beyond this notion. Not just them, but me, I'm realizing now that, you know, we need to make that distinction between academic freedom and intellectual freedom. And I think intellectual freedom is more interesting. And also the idea of the neutrality within the academia, that they will say that, you know, even today, you know, there are universities that think that you have to deal with their own business. You know, we have the stories in Palestine, in Sudan, in all these things. Why do our universities have to deal only with the issues of the students locally? When are we going to bring other issues to the academia? And I think the legacy of national liberation struggles, theoretically, it's interesting, it's a good finding to bring that perspective. You know, the students from this academic association founded in 1963, they started to realize that, you know, there's a fight. And if you read the books and interview them, you will see that from 1963 to the mid-70s, their claims was about local issues from the university. You know, we need papers, we need books, we need to learn about things from outside the Portugal history. Of course, this is very important because they are trying to open, you know, the curriculum to understand other issues. But it was very circumscribed to that colonial landscape. When the Frelimo liberation fighters in Mozambique and MPLA in Angola, in Guinea-Bissau too, the war was becoming very, very crude. You know, you had Amilcar Cabral, Agostinho Neto, Samora Machel, Eduardo Mondlane, Marcelino dos Santos, outside the African continent and within the African continent, but, you know, clandestinely, outside their own national horizons, you know, claiming about, you know, the fight, you know, and the armed struggle. You know, these students started to appropriate the words of the liberation fight. You will see from 1972, their reivindication was about, you know, autonomy, freedom of speech, racism, segregation, and then they will end with a luta continua. The struggle continues. They started to integrate on their fights the slogans from the liberation struggles. And I think this is an interesting, finding. And as I said, we are now dealing with the materials and working on the material. But this is a good finding, that, this idea and pushing forward this concept that, as I said, from Atua and others, that academic freedom has to go beyond academia, and to deal with this idea of the oxymoron, we need to bring, not just the fights that were happening nationally, but also continentally and abroad, as in the 60s and the 70s, the liberation fighters taught us to do that. Sion CP, it's a good thing to rescue today, and I think it as an interesting legacy to think about today. When you think about academics, I think it's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Dr. Fernandez may have caught a bullet that was meant for me. I was the one who did not duly acknowledge my colleagues. I was worried about time. But now that I have time, let me take some minutes to, and I should also blame Prof, because the team is called Team Kabumba, which is my name. So I think that may have led me to have a sincere but mistaken belief that I did all of it myself. Now, it really should be called Team Euripec. The researchers are composed of Geoffrey Obo, who is a doctoral candidate working on the area of academic freedom. We also have Mary Auma Immaculate Dinmoy, who is also a doctoral candidate. She's working on the question around the right of persons with intellectual disabilities to stand for political office. So it's a subversive topic, but she's also involved in the project. We also have Lona Olum Afoyomungu, who is working on the question of Article 4H and its normative contribution to international law. So she brings to this project her understanding of international law. Those three are doctoral candidates who have dedicated time to this project. We also have Sharon Lenny Pamela, a master's student who is working in the area of looking at the reservation by Uganda to, I think it's Article 14 of the Maputo Protocol, where Uganda basically said, we accept the Maputo Protocol, but not the right to self-abortion. And she also brings to the topic her understanding of what is legitimate study, etc., and who can prescribe study, etc. We have, apart from those postgraduate students, we have three undergraduate students. One is Harry Mwesigwa, who has finished his LLB and is just concluding his LDC. We also have Claire Ninsima and Vanessa Rebecca Nasamula. Now those two have just finished their LLBs. So it's quite a team. Now the work generated by this entire team was also submitted to the colleagues from the Human Rights and Peace Center and the School of Law more generally, who also provided input. So really, it has been a labor of many and of love. And incidentally, as I read out the names, I can see many of the names are women. So maybe it was not only a case of not attributing, but also there's a case of men mansplaining and taking credit for the work of ladies, for which I'm deeply sorry. And if there was space to kneel, I would. The idea of, I think the question was about why prescribe it to higher education institutions. It's just to suggest, again, that conceptually, everyone has the right, and I think that's how it's described in a lot of the constitutions, that even Article 21, 1B of the Ghanaian Constitution, that it begins with an articulation of freedom of expression generally, and then says including academic freedom. And actually in Uganda's constitution, Article 29, it says academic freedom in institutions of higher learning. So it's actually specific in that sense. So the idea of speaking of, in the first sense, academic freedom in higher education institutions is not to suggest that everyone else doesn't have the right to speak, express their opinions. They do. Because this is a specific right. But it's just to say that there's being a specific and unique right based on certain considerations of age, of expertise, etc., it might need special protection. Now, I understand that this might be in tension with part of the views of Dr. Fernandez and his team. But I think it is one of the ways of reconciling, if at all possible, would be to, again, to say the broad idea, the freedom of thought is a general freedom. Freedom of thought, conscience, and belief, and to express those ideas, a general freedom, enjoyed by everyone. But that what we're talking about, whether you're talking about academic freedom or intellectual freedom, is something of a different kind. And that different kind, I think, is that needs special protection. Now, it's not to suggest that the two worlds are separate, rigidly separate. Mackay University is right in an area that is next to a slum, right? So it's, I don't know, we are of the community and the community is within us. And it's not to say that the tower, but who talked about taking the rope to the town, the gown to the town? It happens. But it's also to say that the university, there's something sanctified, I think, about the university. I don't know if now, months change, I don't know if it was this year or last year, we were requested by Tundu Lissu, the Tanzanian opposition candidate. He wanted to give a talk at the university. It seemed to be like, Tanzania now is a very hot thing. I would be interested to hear from my colleagues from Tanzania. But we had never had such pushback. Never in the history of the barazas we had had at Curipec, people would come speak and go away. But for this particular speaker, the communications, some of which I cannot disclose, but the communications, diplomatic and otherwise, to stop this human being from speaking were interesting. Nevertheless, he had his speech at the Human Rights and Peace Center, and he then said that he said it was impossible for him to give that lecture that he had just given, that he was going to give at the University of Dar es Salaam. I think that's what universities can bring to the other communities, it's like a church or another kind of religious institution, for lack of a better word, is to say that there's this space that, because of what goes on in that space, free inquiry, on both the part of researchers, students, yes, but also those who come into the space. Maybe that's where that freedom is shared and can be enjoyed by those who, and that's precisely why that space should be recognized as special. That there he could speak. Now, as we all know, he's in prison. He went back to Tanzania and is charged with treason. So in Tanzania, he was not free. But maybe that's precisely why academic freedom should be not only protected, but also delineated, to be very clear as to what we're talking about. That we're not talking about the freedom of thought which is enjoyed by everyone. Rather, we're suggesting that there's something uniquely distinctive about higher education institutions in terms of their role, in terms of what they do, in terms of their functions, in terms of their expertise, that should be protected as such, and then opened up to other people who can come and enjoy that special freedom, whether geographically or in terms of expertise, etc. That really, for us, is the idea, and I think it's quite open to debate, and I'm sure we shall debate it over the next 3 days. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for your responses. All right. So we have just 10 minutes to end this session. So I have more hands up, but we have just 10 minutes. So we will take just 3 questions and kindly make it short. Kindly make it short so that the responses would also follow immediately. All right. So the microphones.
Hello, good evening, good afternoon to everybody. So I will speak in Portuguese to Fernando's team. E sendo breve, só queria dizer que achei muito interessante essa diferença que traz entre a liberdade académica e a liberdade intelectual. é algo que chama muito a minha atenção, porque, particularmente no contexto cabo-verdiano, a existência dos intelectuais precede a existência dos académicos, né? Como mostrou na sua apresentação, né, as academias aparecem, já são projetos do século XXI. Antes tínhamos institutos de formação superior, mas desde o século XIX, Cabo Verde foi ali instalado o seminário e liceu, que funcionou como um organismo eclesiástico, mas também civil. Então, tanto é que é o liceu de Gilianes, que em 1917 depois toma o lugar desse seminário, mas durante 50 anos, então de 66 até 1917, esse seminário formou boa parte dos quadros que inclusive viria a trabalhar nas outras colónias. Mas também gerou várias correntes literárias que produziram um grande número de intelectuais. Outra questão interessante ali é considerar a forma como as elites tinham acesso à formação superior, mas em Portugal. O que muitas vezes não tornou interessante criar universidades em Cabo Verde, porque era exatamente para as elites, e as elites tinham condições para enviar os filhos estudarem em Portugal. Então, hoje, já correndo, há esse choque entre os intelectuais e os académicos. E por isso que eu achei muito interessante a questão que coloca das duas verdades. Porque os intelectuais muitas vezes põem em causa a qualidade dos académicos pelo fato de terem, sei lá, uma certa legitimidade social, né, enquanto intelectuais. Mas, havendo pouco tempo, podemos continuar a discutir isso mais tarde. Okay, obrigado.
Can I go? Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Pastor Saraba. I'm from Botswana. My question is directed to Dr. Bahamba's team, and it's very short. How did the team emphasize the protection of academic freedom to extend to administrators? Thank you. Because I mean, with the academics, it's very clear and straightforward. When you publish something or you express your thoughts, and that right is violated, then you can perhaps approach the courts on the premise of your freedom, academic freedom being violated. I just wonder about administrators. What is it that they would be covered for? Thank you. Okay, thank you. My name is Elias from Ghana, from the University for Development Studies. So representing the University of Nigeria. My question goes to yes. I'm interested in the clauses there, academic freedom clauses and charters. In a way that you discovered how these are implemented, are you able to share with us in some very few minutes the state of freedom in Africa? Because all of us are basically driving these freedom powers from either the regional, national, or global charters, or probably from various constitutions and statutes. With your research and exposures on this, are you able to share with us the current state of how countries are applying to these specific clauses? Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have the responses from our team? Yeah. Team Kambuba, you're taking it first.
Take a minute, I think. Now, I think I'll start with the question of administrators. I know it's a bit counterintuitive.
and it actually comes from one of the Kenyan cases, apart from the other documents that reference it. The one where the Kenya Academic Staff Union was an ex parte case. The idea that the whole process of a chain is implicated, and there's another Kenyan case actually which dealt with a doctoral student and the committee, the resolution of the committee. Now, if I teach a class and I mark I grade it, I'm protected in terms of what I did. But there's a registrar, the School of Law, who must take the minutes and implement the directive that said, as the supervisor, I'm satisfied that, well, there's a panel before whom the student defended their dissertation. The panel passed the student with minor corrections. I supervised the compliance and signed the compliance form. The registrar's duty is to sign off and send those minutes to the higher degrees committee. What if that particular student is an opposition candidate and there's a great interest on the part of the state that that student not graduate? Now, if I'm protected and the panel of adjudicators, the examiners are protected, but the registrar who transmits those minutes, who certifies the decision of the board and transmits to the higher degrees committee, if that particular person, that link in the chain is not protected in his role, then there's a break in that particular chain. You have a student who has done their work and cannot graduate. So, of course, I guess it's derivative. I guess you can then say it's a derivative protection. For administrators, their role is, they are protected under that rubric insofar as their role is so intrinsically linked and inextricably linked to what academics are doing that to try to excise the two would mean that the academics cannot be productive, cannot be effective. Or that it might even mean that the students cannot learn. I mean, one of the other things that registrars do that is really boring is to process payments for external examiners. If payments are not processed, people don't graduate. It sounds mundane, it sounds bureaucratic, but they're part of the machine that is the production of knowledge. So it's, yeah, you could say it's a derivative or a derived insofar as they are linked to or a part of the community. The question for my colleague from Ghana, there's an interesting book that was published by Balakrishnan Rajagopal. It's entitled International Law from Below. The project that we're engaged in, or that African academics have been engaged in at least since 1990, is precisely this project of international law from below. Because ideally, it's normally the states that sign treaties, and then it rains down on us like rain. But this project is from the users, from those affected, from Dar es Salaam, the staff unions, from Kampala, Kodesria, and 2025 Kodesria, and again 2025 ACAF. It is a product of efforts of those who are suffering most from the lack of academic freedom to mobilize norms and to generate norms. It's a form, if you like, of norm entrepreneurship. We're trying to make law. Now, the literature in this kind of lawmaking is that you succeed if you can, as much as possible, model your lawmaking process to the traditional lawmaking process. In other words, if you can show that the declaration that is being made in Accra or that might be made in Accra next year or something reflects existing international law, existing state practice. So if you can show, for instance, that out of the 15, 20, 25 principles of academic freedom that have been articulated, you're not creating anything, rather you are collating what already exists in terms of the ICCPR, the Declaration of Human Rights, etc., then you have a stronger case. That's why it's relevant how many African countries have this freedom in their constitutions, how many cases have been subjected to etc. So the state of implementation is good. Maybe it's something for us to check to see the extent to which these documents have been expressly referenced. I know the European Court has in some kind of self-reinforcing process, cited its own principles and guidelines, but that might also be something. But to the extent that you have decisions, constitutions, some acts of parliament that reflect the same norms, the same ideas, we're on the right track. I think the point can be made that this process of norm generation will ultimately be successful, even though there's no express reference to these declarations as such. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, can we have the responses from?
I think it's very brief because I think it's only one from Cape Verde. Yes, I like that idea. Thank you very much. Intellectuals preceded academics. That's we're gonna take that. And most of them they went to Portugal to study because there was no universities in all these countries. They had to go to Portugal, and in the case of Mozambique, South Africa. And I think one of the reasons that the colonial administration, the Portuguese, decided to create universities was first the liberation struggle that was going very strong, the armed struggle, the pressures, United Nations, the organizations from Africa, CNCP and all these things, but also because they wanted to control these people that are Mozambicans, natives that are going to study in South Africa and in Portugal. And for them, they were acquiring these modernist ideas and ideas of fighting and nationalism and all these things. So having universities in Mozambique, in the colonies, was for them was secure because they could control this population. The other thing, just to finish, it's also important finding of this research is that we have to link this not just nationally but globally. There is a very important institution in Portugal, Casa dos Estudantes do Império, the house of the students of the empire, which was founded in 1944. And the idea was to bring all these students from the colonies, the African colonies, to Portugal, to control them too. To control them. They will be there. They will have a space to discuss things about their places, but in a very circumscribed place and very controlled by the secret police in Portugal. But this was the place that all these nationalist leaders was born there. It was a place of fermentation of ideas of nationalism. So it went against the idea of the colonial state. In the end, I finish now. In the end, in my presentation, I mentioned the Center for African Studies, founded in 1976, which became, in my argument, the new African hub in social science research and international activism in Africa. The end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s, Maputo was the place to be. Tanzanians were there, people, Congolese, Jacques de Pelchamp was there, Colin Dutch who was also in Dar es Salaam was there, Ruth First from South Africa was killed in Mozambique, in the Center for African Studies, by a letter bomb, was in Mozambique. Colin Dutch, Bridget O'Laughlin, many people from all over the world were there. And in 1980, they founded a journal called Mozambican Studies. And the slogan of the journal was, "We are a theoretical magazine, but not academic." So they wanted to make sure that this distinction between, intellectual fights, intellectual work, and academia, they wanted to, in the 1980s, to move beyond academia and say, our journal of social science is theoretical but not academic, because it's integrated, assimilated by this kind of engaged scholarship, of Marxism, political economy, political economy, and all these kinds of things. But critical, engaged scholarship that goes beyond the national context and all these kind of things. So yeah, another finding for this report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, we have exceeded time for this session. So unfortunately, we are not able to take more questions. But then subsequently, there are more questions. So subsequently, it will be discussed during the group sessions. I think this is setting the stage for more discussions for tomorrow. So I want to thank everybody for your participation, for the comments, and then the questions. And I want to thank our researchers, the research team, also for responding to the questions. Thank you very much. So the next on the program is coffee break at the same venue. Yes. So after
So, but that is not our topic. Our topic is gender and academic freedom. And I have two experts here who will talk about gender and academic freedom. And maybe a request from the organizers next time should put a gentleman here in the panel like this, because gender is not about women. Gender is a relationship. Yeah. So next time, please, let's combine. Let's engender the panel. So we'll start with Professor Yusra Hamdou. Yusra Hamdou is an assistant professor of international relations at the Faculty of Law, Economics and Sciences, Social Sciences at Muhammadiyah University Hassan II of Casablanca, Morocco. She is interested in issues related to security, counter-terrorism, violent extremism, and soft power in the Sahel and North Africa. Yusra has conducted field work in Mali, Niger, Mauritania, Senegal, and Morocco. Her postdoctoral fellowship at the Institute of Humanities in Africa, HUMA, at the University of Cape Town, focused on scholarly publishing in Africa, and she focused on North Africa and East and the Horn of Africa. She's also a Mellon SAR, Academic Freedom, and her research at HUMA as a visiting fellow focuses on the role of AI in scholarly publishing, particularly how editors perceive its impact on ethical policies, authority, and governance. What a rich experience. Welcome, Prof, for your presentation. So you can be general. What are key opportunities and challenges on gender and academic freedom, focusing on Morocco and in Africa generally? Welcome.
Thank you, Anna. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I would like to thank EICA for the opportunity to share my thoughts and research on academic freedom from a gender perspective. This research is part of the Mellon Foundation and Scholars at Risk Fellowship program for 2024-2025. Initially, it was a comparative study between Morocco and South Africa that I carried on academic freedom from a gender perspective that I carried on with a colleague based in South Africa, but I will be focusing today on my findings on Morocco. I will maybe here is how I will proceed first. So I will introduce briefly my research. Then I will speak about the legal and policy framework of higher education in Morocco, and especially universities. Then I'll speak briefly about the methodology of my research and share some of the findings of this research. So in Morocco, women scholars are predominantly represented in the social sciences, where they have historically found professional opportunities despite finding barriers to participation in the STEM fields. So, however, recent institutional shifts driven by funding constraints and the prioritization of STEM disciplines are contributing to the marginalization of social sciences. And these trends, they pose a challenge to academic freedom by narrowing the spaces in which women scholars teach, conduct research, and contribute to knowledge production. So in my research, I ask this question: how is academic freedom perceived and practiced by female Moroccan scholars across disciplines, and particularly female scholars in social sciences? The analysis draws on qualitative interviews with 10 female Moroccan academics to unpack how academic freedom is simultaneously claimed, constrained, internalized within the Moroccan political and cultural boundaries. So I will speak a bit about the legal and policy framework. So we have one law, the law number 0100, enacted in 2000. It provides the legal framework for Morocco's higher education system, defining both the missions and governance of universities. According to the Article 3, universities are tasked with strengthening national and Islamic identity, providing initial and continuing education, fostering knowledge and cultural development, preparing the workforce, conducting scientific and technological research, offering expertise and consultation, contributing to national development and promoting universal values. Legally, Moroccan universities are public institutions with administrative and financial autonomy and legal personality under Article 46 of the Constitution. They remain under the state supervision to ensure compliance with laws and assigned missions. There is no mention of academic freedom in this law that organizes the higher education in Morocco, but there is only the mention of the freedom to learn for students. And students are granted the freedom to learn in the Article 70 of this law, including access to information and expression within university premises, as long as such freedoms do not disrupt institutional operations, student life, or the work of faculty and staff. So there is no, legally speaking, there is no mention of academic freedom in the laws that organizes higher education in Morocco. Concerning the methodology of my research, so I did a qualitative methodology based on 10 semi-structured interviews conducted between February and April 2025 with Moroccan female academics, both from public and private universities, 3 female scholars and researchers from STEM disciplines, and 7 from social sciences. So the interviews explored participants' perceptions of academic freedom, experiences of censorship, do they experience self-censorship, professional challenges, and from gender perspective, in the impact of the marginalization of the social sciences, and also the influence of the cultural and political context. And finally, how they do, what are the strategies they deploy to protect their intellectual autonomy. So some of the findings of this research on first the perception of academic freedom. There is a rejection of the idea of academic freedom as a right in the Moroccan context, preferring to define it as a practice, something exercised conditionally and situationally, rather than guaranteed institutionally. So it's a practice. There is one of my interviewees said, I would frame it more as a practice, not as a right. Academic freedom in Morocco lacks the normative and legal protection associated with rights. It depends on how one navigates institutional and political constraints. So academic freedom in Morocco is not an institutionalized right, but a conditional, performative practice that depends on navigating political taboos and structural hierarchies. The university, instead of being a site of debate and knowledge production, it functions as a bureaucratic apparatus reproducing conformity and authority. Also, concerning the perception of academic freedom, one other interviewee from social sciences, said that academic freedom operates as a structural illusion, formally recognized but tightly regulated by institutional and political boundaries. It is freedom under surveillance, constrained by red lines, or what we call the federative constants in Morocco, which are monarchy, religion, and territorial sovereignty. As one respondent said, I am here for my gagne-pain. I don't want any trouble. So reflecting the pragmatic balance between intellectual independence and professional security. So, but when it comes to STEM, so there is I didn't feel this tension. There is no tension when we speak about academic freedom. This tension is less evident in the STEM field, where academic freedom equates with the protection of ideas, patents, and resources. Research priorities are oriented toward efficiency, productivity, and contributions to national development rather than critical reflection. The second element on self-censorship, so it is a structural practice. So self-censorship emerges as a central mechanism through which control over academic freedom operates in Morocco's higher education system. Self-censorship is deeply ingrained in the system. The freedom becomes a personal act of courage, not a collective or institutional principle. There is also the reinforcement of a culture of preemptive caution. As one of the PhD students I interviewed, she said, my first experience of censorship with my female supervisor. She said, or she told me, you don't have to tackle sensitive topics. So this also extends to the psychological level, while fear of professional sanctions, loss of access, or social judgment leads to a kind of internalized form of self-restraint. In STEM disciplines, self-censorship takes on different shapes, so driven by, as I said, confidentiality requirements, protection of patents, etc. So on the cultural and political context, so academic freedom is bounded by Morocco's, what I said, the federative constants, religion, monarchy, and territorial integrity that are enshrined and mentioned in the constitution. Academic freedom in Morocco starts from the respect of these three elements. So and professors often capitalize on these taboos to gain political privileges, to writing, for example, about the monarchy or the Western Sahara issue, etc. So conformity is rewarded. Intellectual loyalty becomes a form of political capital. When it comes to, for example, within university departments, there is a gender bias and informal coalitions that exclude often women from real decision, from leadership. So they reduce their role to symbolic participation in votes. So you can find women, for example, that are who are laboratory directors, but we don't have a female director of the public department, public department, for example. So as a result, many women so they feel excluded from the leadership within universities. The gendered challenges in academia, so women scholars in Morocco encounter intersecting barriers that limit their academic participation and advancement. They face sexism and exclusion. Most important faculty decisions are sometimes made in informal professional spaces outside of the academic space. Their careers are often hindered by stagnation and underrepresentation in leadership positions because, 2 minutes, these positions usually they are politicized positions. They are not based on merit and excellence. So yes. So and maybe I'll move to the what are the strategies they adopt to preserve their academic freedom. So one of the interesting findings was that language sometimes is used as a filter and as a weapon at the same time. Writing in English will limit the public reach. So publishing, for example, in English may offer a temporary shield because it limits the audience and thus political sensitivity. As one of the interviewees said, if you are writing in English, it bothers, but it's not a big issue because it's limited. However, if there is an international visibility, it can also backfire. So as critical writing in English will, with global reach, can threaten Morocco's international image. So language functions both as a filter and a weapon. There is also something that our colleague from Mozambique said, so freedom beyond academia. So this is one of the alternatives. So the true intellectual freedom may exist outside of the academic space. So one of the interviewees said, the best place where you can speak and write is outside of the university. Academic freedom is paradoxical. It cannot fully exist within institutional academia, which itself reproduces control, bureaucracy, and inequality. So the critical discourse migrates outside of academia to other spaces, to militancy and to journalism. So in Morocco, most of the most important and sensitive debates, they are not within academia, but they are outside of academia. So in the militancy spaces. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have one short follow-up question. Now that in Morocco, academic freedom is not a right, because it's not a legal right, right?
Yeah.
It is not in the law. So it's a practice.
Yes.
And again, there are challenges of sexual bias and gender bias. What is the role of universities or academic institutions, at least to curb this, or to advocate for it to be in the laws, in the system of the country? Yeah. So maybe you can highlight an opportunity which the universities can tap in.
Within universities, and especially where we teach humanities and social sciences, I don't see any form of resistance within the university, because we have a very complex relationship and history of censorship and creativity, the censorship of creativity in general in Morocco. In the 70s and 80s, universities were the fief of opposition. So they were students and professors that were repressed, heavily repressed. So there is a kind of fatigue. And today, within the academic space, I think that fatigue, but also there is a kind of cooptation that is also practiced by the state. So there is a kind of people want to preserve this statu quo. So there is no resistance. We want to preserve the statu quo. We want to also preserve this comfort zone when we are. So, and we internalize this censorship, this censorship that is practiced also by the state and the political and cultural contexts in Morocco.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll come back to you later on. Now let's listen to Dr. Stella Nyanzi. Dr. Stella Nyanzi is a fellow of the Philip Schwartz Initiative for Researchers at Risk at the Rural University in Bochum. She has a PhD in medical anthropology from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She has a Master's of Science in Medical Anthropology from University College London and a Bachelor of Arts in Mass Communication and Literature from Makerere University in Uganda. She has 25 years researching about intersection of culture, health, law, gender, and sexualities. You're welcome, Dr. Stella. You discuss beyond gender and academic freedom in African academia generally. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. I have some slides which are showing, yes? Okay. So I've been introduced. I won't go into this. I want to thank you very much for reminding them that we need men too when we're discussing gender. And I think that the previous discussion has done an elaborate job of introducing some of the issues I would have wanted to go into if I was dealing with gender. But I want to take us beyond gender and ask questions around academic freedom. What does it mean for scholars whose research is criminalized, pathologized, demonized, called alien, westernized, and penalized by state legislation. I also want to look at, ignore the numbers, I made my slides during the break. I want to look at gender beyond the construction within so-called African tradition that says they are men and women, period, girls and boys. What about transgender persons? What about intersex persons? What about the third gendered people? And is there space for us to consider these ideas? And I want to look at gender beyond what I'm calling heteronormativity, beyond the patriarchy, because we cannot discuss freedom if we are only discussing freedoms of the dominant ideology. Do homosexual scholars have academic freedom? Do lesbian professors have academic freedom? Because there are minorities who are queer and academic and African. Can we discuss minorities when we talk about gender? And I also want to look at the question of academic freedom for those of us who are subversive and dissident and really political in our work. We don't just look at ourselves as people who produce knowledge for the ivory tower, but we are also engaged intellectuals. I have written a paper, so moving on, I don't know how I move on. I was told there's a pointer that moves with me, but I have written a paper just after the anti-homosexuality law was passed in my country. I'm from Uganda, and I was writing an opinion view that was published in Nature Human Behavior, where I talk about what homophobia does to academic freedom. Because very many of us within the universities in Africa are homophobic. And so coming from a place of resistance where I think that we must have the freedom as African scholars to study homosexualities, I wrote about academic freedom being threatened by the homophobia within even the movement that's fighting for academic freedom. Next slide, please. In terms of criminalizing homosexualities in Uganda and maybe in most of the other African countries, I know that Ghana, this is a hot question. I know that in Nigeria, in Gambia, in Kenya, in so many other African countries, this question has arisen many times. In Uganda, people talked about the death penalty and they were horrified that in 2023 we had a re-entry of this law. But very little was discussed around promotion of homosexuality, which does not even go into the sexualities of people, but looks at knowledge creation. And in terms of definition, a person who promotes homosexuality commits an offense and is liable on conviction to imprisonment to a period not exceeding 20 years. So maximum penalty is 20 years in prison. Definition D says that this person who promotes homosexuality knowingly, I think let's look at B, knowingly advertises, publishes, prints, broadcasts, distributes, or causes the advertisement, publication, printing, broadcasting, or distribution by any means, including the use of a computer, information system, or the internet, of any material promoting or encouraging homosexuality, or the commission of an offense under this act. For 20 years, I have studied human sexualities. I have at least 60 publications looking at human sexualities, both heterosexualities and homosexualities. My expertise as an academic scholar is in the area of human sexualities. I am unapologetically feminist, queer, and African. I believe that in creating knowledge around the topic of homosexualities, we cannot allow the West to speak for Africa. African scholars must participate in knowledge creation around even this topic that may be accultural, that may be discomforting, that may be outside your religion. We too must partake in knowledge generation around this sensitive topic. Whether we are biologists, social scientists, artists, or whatever, we have a right, especially those of us who are willing and daring to do so. In terms of the problematics, is that the Ugandan National Science for Science and Technology, the national body that's mandated to review our ethics and science, coordinate all the research in the country, gave a statement. And the statement is requiring Ugandan scholars to report homosexual people. This is the Ugandan National Council for Science and Technology, surveilling, policing, monitoring, encouraging researchers to tell tales on their research participants. They even have issues around confidentiality. And they skip the confidentiality clause and say, you must report. What does academic freedom mean? For me as an academic scholar, as a thinker, as a teacher, who wants to generate knowledge, what does it mean in this context? This is not colonial times. This is 2023. This was written in 2023, 27th October 2023. Okay? And Dr. Kabumba Businje, wonderful lawyer, scholar, professor of human rights and Peace Center, was part of the people who petitioned our Constitutional Court. And I think you talked very beautifully about how they went about academic freedom in the petition. Even the judges of our country let this fly past. So I have no protection to do my research. I'm in exile today. I live in Germany today. I have got a Philip Schwartz Initiative scholar for researchers at risk. Because what happens to my research? 25 years. Well, what happens to me? I'm not saying I want to go and kiss a woman. I'm talking about doing research on this sensitive topic. Who is going to fight for me and my academic freedom? I'm a nude protester as well. My right as an academic scholar to participate in dissidents at the university. I share a picture of my nude protest outside Makerere Institute of Social Research, where I was protesting against Professor Mamdani for violating my labor rights, abusing my contract at the university. This is not outside. This is dissidents, feminist resistance, undressing proudly in the ways of my people. I didn't just take my nude protests to the university. I took them to court. And I have a little inset where I'm actually taking feminist resistance that we teach at universities inside a courtroom on the day of my sentencing. So I'm not ashamed of doing feminist teaching in courtrooms, doing feminist teaching as a protester. This is how I teach and pass on knowledge. You can laugh at me. You can try to shame me. You will not be different from the feminists. Dr. Miriam Matembe is a leading feminist scholar in Uganda. She has a PhD. She's the leader of the feminist movement. She said Stella Nyanzi is mentally sick. They pathologize our modes of teaching when our modes of teaching are feminist but outside the norm. What is the place of academic freedom to do non-normative dissident teaching? Professor Sylvia Tamale, an amazing feminist professor of law who has later gone on to defend nude protests. When she came to the scene of my protest inside the university, she told me to dress up. She told the policemen to take away the journalists who had cameras. And later on, she had a moment of reflection and realized what our own, you talked about culture and what it does in terms of taking away from us the potential we can use to protect and participate in our own freedom, right? And later on, after Sylvia had criticized my mode of thinking around protest at the university, she had an inaugural lecture, Nudity Protest and the Law in Uganda. Her inaugural lecture that makes her professor is based on my nudity and my nude protest. And so many feminists in Africa have gone on to study that which they had thought was mentally sick and pathologized. So African nudity, women's nudity is a form of knowledge we've passed on for generations. But to decolonize means that we have to even think beyond what colonial modes of academic freedom mean to us. And the very last slide I have is around dissidents. because I am a political dissident. I have been arrested so many times, protesting because I am tired of being an academic who sits just in the university to produce knowledge just for the university. It is not enough for us as an academic intelligentsia to have all that we have and sit in dictatorships and think we can belong just to our ivory towers. So what does academic freedom mean for dissidents who are anti-government? My biggest form of protest has been with poetry. And when analyzing whether or not my productions are academic, scholars at risk told me that that is art. It is outside the university. I write dirty little poems about dictator Yoweri Museveni and his mother's vagina. I write dirty little poems about dictator Yoweri Museveni and his penis that is raping the constitution of Uganda. I write vulgar poetry, and I have been taken to court very many times. But I'm a poet. I was educated using government funds in literature and mass communication. When the academics in Makerere University say she is a poet, she is not a medical anthropologist when she's writing this poetry, what does it mean to distinguish between poetic justice and academic freedom? When do we draw the lines between dissidents, as that is activism, and this is her academic knowledge generation? And so I have questions around what it means to be an academic. Is it about the geography of the university? I'm an anthropologist. We do ethnographies in the field. My field is the whole wide world. I can do my geography inside prison, at parliament, on the streets, because I'm an anthropologist. My field can be anywhere. So what does it mean to protect my knowledge creation outside the classroom? Because as an academic researcher, my school is not the classroom. It's the field. I do field work. When I teach dissident studies or resistant studies, I do them with the whole world. And so my questions really, the three questions that I started with, are important. What does academic freedom mean? For those of us who are different to you, who are normative, you love the norm. I'm extra normal. And we too are academics, and we are Africans, and we must belong to these definitions, especially of African, Pan-African freedom. Stop excluding us. And I'm looking at you because you know why. We need to open up the frontiers of what academic freedom means, such that we're not just protecting the status quo. Even minorities and queers and dissidents belong. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. One follow-up question. What is an opportunity now? No, you've talked about challenges. You've been arrested several times. You are living in exile. Yeah. So you've suffered a lot. And I know people in Uganda who are protecting sexuality rights are suffering, but they are suffering in isolation. Everyone is fighting his or her own battle. There's not like people coming together, academicians coming together and fighting together against the abusers. So what is an opportunity to bring academicians together to fight for the rights?
Right, so I think that some of the solutions were offered in the first presentation, where publication in languages outside, publishing outside Makerere, outside Uganda, all those are part of it. But I want to begin by saying that academics are coming together. Resistance is happening at the university. When I was starting, I think at some point I looked at BK Businje Kabumba, who presented about the Huripec team, because the petition that was taken to the Constitutional Court of Uganda, some of the petitioners are professors of law. Some of the civil society organizations, the names that were written on the petition belong to students who are taught at Makerere University by professors of law. And so already in terms, and the petition was really contesting the constitutionality of the Anti-Homosexuality Act in Uganda. And so already there are spaces of resistance and solidarity. We are not necessarily divided or fragmented or isolated. There's a lot of organizing. I mean, you can speak about, I left Uganda in 2021, so you can speak about what's happening, but as far as I know, there's a lot of building of resistance, because we must. I have been called an activist academic, which is true. I took on the resistance because I'm not the only one. There are others who came before me. Even the first Anti-Homosexuality Act of 2009, the petition was lobbied together with academics at the forefront. Of course, they are the minority, right? Of course, there's a lot of stigma. Of course, there is a cost to going against the status quo, but there is a movement, and that is important. So I think in terms of your question was, what can we do? We are doing. We are not desperate. We are not, the suffering may be there. Those of us who must flee will flee. Exile is not retreat. Exile is a time to re-strategize. I keep saying to people who say, oh, you're suffering in exile. No, I'm not. Exile is part of the revolutions that have come before us. And I think that if we stayed in the country to be imprisoned, then our potential is taken off the battleground. If I am in the country and I'm murdered, a dead soldier cannot fight. But if I'm in exile, we continue online organizing, online participation. Now I'm at a university. I will get grants to do the research that must be done. I have protections from the ethic boards, ethic review boards that are outside Uganda, and I can partner with scholars in Uganda. I can publish in journals that are outside Uganda. There are possibilities if we allow ourselves to imagine beyond the oppressor's modes of thinking.
Thank you so much. Yeah, in human rights, we have a saying, we say, a human rights defender is better alive than dead. Because if you are dead, then you can't defend human rights. So sometimes even staying in exile is an opportunity. It's a good strategy. So now I would invite you for questions, discussions, any comments on what has been presented. You can ask a question to any of them or general question. Yes, I've seen 1, 2, Prof. Kojo, and my brother there. So you can start. 1, the second, third.
I thank you very much for the presentation and the presenters. I think they are representing women well. As I rightly said initially, that this academic freedom must be fought from within. Otherwise, there is no way. And my sister from Morocco.
I'm sorry to cut you short.
My sister.
Sorry to cut you short. You mention your name so that they.
Okay, I am Dr. Brahma Gegbe from Sierra Leone. I'm glad that you mentioned that when you're about to start your research, the first challenge you met is from within, your supervisor. My question is this, and I'm coming, but I still want to follow what I'm seeing, what I've experienced, what I've played with in academia. The hate, the misconception, and the politics. For example, in Sierra Leone, here is somebody who is a professor, who is in charge of a commission, Tertiary Education Commission. And this is a commission that is responsible for regulating the conditions of service of academic. When he was about to be promoted to professor at that level, they were using simple ways And because they've crossed that level, and now they are getting older, and they don't want the younger ones to meet them over the bridge. So what they did, they went quickly. These are professors, these are academics. Quickly and reviewed these conditions of service and made them difficult for young ones in the university not to grow. So you can see, please, man, I will be happy enough to tell me, or this august body, what method did you use to achieve your research objectives? What to able to overcome this very academic giant that advised you that this research interest is not good for you?
Thank you.
I will really be happy if you tell us that one. Okay, I'm coming to the second presenter. The issue of homosexual is a norm. I can see your point as academic because you even fight for the minority. And the problem you are facing in Uganda is not only Uganda, it's a fight for all Africans. Very recently, I am part of the technical committee of Statistics Sierra Leone. So when they are to have a definition of sex, so I raised the concern. The people who are coming, the transgender, they are coming. If you talk about transgender in the 70s, 80s, or 2000, now they are coming. In my country, they are now coming publicly to do public engagement with parties. So they will go and arrest them. That one has never happened in history. So homosexual sex, the consideration of other parties in terms of sex or the definition of sex in the African context. How best will you think you can succeed in getting that definition? Not in the Donald Trump way. Only male and female. How best can you move to ensure you achieve that in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. The second person, yes. Please be brief so that many people can ask.
Okay. Hello. Good afternoon. Okay. First to, Yusra, Dr. Yusra. Yes. You mentioned, this different dynamics between the STEMs and the social science and humanities in terms of, fighting for academic freedom. I don't know if you could elaborate more on that, and maybe if asking if your research are also looking, I don't know, maybe in a long duration, not too long, but looking at the colonial dynamics and to see how it happened in colonial Morocco, all these struggles about academic freedom. Because, in the case of Mozambique, for instance, the first leaders of the association, the Students' Association, were from the faculties of medicine and engineers. Of course, there was no social science, but even after, in the 1972 and 73, when the Students' Association became more radicalized and started to bring the ideas from Frelimo's liberation struggles into their claims, right? For instance, books from Lenin, Marx, Mayakovsky, Rosa Luxemburg were banned, and they were reading that books. At that time, all these people from STEMs, from social science, they were reading and participating in that kind of struggle, intellectual struggles. Maybe it will be interesting to look at that kind of engaged scholarship that moved beyond disciplinary boundaries. I think it's a legacy that we have to take something from there.
Thank you.
The second question also for you. What do you think also using ethnography for your study? You talk about archival work and interviews, but I think the work that Bruno Latour does, the anthropology of the laboratory, doing ethnographies in the scientific laboratories. Maybe it will be also interesting to have an ethnography of that university in Morocco. Be there, not just interview them. I don't know. Maybe you say that you teach there. But okay, not just being there teaching, but also being as an ethnographer doing that research, not just getting them when you're doing interviews, but doing an ethnography. I don't know, ethnography. And for Stella, there is some positive. I'm going to share some positive examples from LGBT studies in Mozambique. For instance, we have seminars, workshops on LGBT studies at my university. We have, I know, 2 PhD doctor did the PhDs on lesbians, and we have and they are doing research on that kind of issues. So there's some positives there.
Thank you so much. Maybe you give the microphone to your neighbor there, and then one microphone should come down here to Professor Achua. So you can start asking while the mic is going to Professor Achua. Yes, please. Professor Quad, do you have a microphone? Maybe you can ask why they are.
Obrigado. Vou falar em português. Chamo-me Luís da Costa, sou da Guiné-Bissau.
Sorry, we don't have the devices. So you can start asking while we are being sorted.
Thank you. Dr. Nyanzi, thank you for your presentation. I think it reflected the difficult, radical character that your work exhibits. And my question is, you began with a question, but I want to throw the question back at you. You're talking about how do you define academic freedom when certain practices in the society are penalized or seen as an aberration. Yeah, and I think it also reflects in your pedagogical style. So what, in your own opinion, based on the radical or dissident approach to knowledge production and dissemination of knowledge, how will you define academic freedom in that context? I think it's something that interests me very much. And to use, I wanted to ask, I know that generally, I mean, having had a feel a little bit about social life in Morocco, I know that generally it's a more cosmopolitan society in terms of connection with certain other Arab countries and so on. Doesn't that make an impact in terms of how the contention or the tension between gender and academics or academic freedom? And so would you say that it is more liberal in that sense in Morocco than perhaps other Muslim countries that you may have studied? And to what extent in this case does Islamic culture have on academic freedom? Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we are ready to receive the question in Portu. Welcome.
Obrigado. A minha pergunta vai para a professora Yusura. Logo na sua apresentação diz que a liberdade acadêmica é uma prática, digamos, é uma prática. E uma vez que ela fez um estudo comparativo entre Marrocos
e com um colega de África do Sul.
Okay. Fez uma comparação, diz que ele fez uma comparação. Agora, eu não percebi como é que essa prática, o que é que ele considera como a liberdade acadêmica e como é que essa incidência na cultura marroquina é exercida, uma vez sendo uma prática, significa que se essa prática é exercida tanto na escola ou fora dela. Essa é a primeira questão. Para segundo a apresentadora, a doutora Estela, ela falou da liberdade acadêmica em termos gerais e dos dados de incidência da liberdade acadêmica.
Como é que ele compara em termos estatísticos
Tanto o gênero feminino como o gênero masculino and masculine gender o gênero feminino
academic freedom. Do you think like the feminine gender has they have been resistant more in the terms of academic freedom or
mais feminista?
In the feminist view? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we'll now give the responses. There are a lot of questions. These people are used to set exams, so they ask really tough questions. But I know you're experts who can respond. So you're welcome. We start with Dr. Nyanzi and then Professor will come second.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. The question around from Sierra Leone, sorry, the name is difficult, but at least I know the country. What is the definition of alternative genders not in the Donald Trump way? I think that was your question. And I think it's a valid question because if we're talking about academic freedom, it would be good for us to also Africanize these issues. So in terms of transgender, I mean, you said they are coming. Actually, they've been here for a very long time. Maybe not visible, but they've been here. They are with us. They've been with us. They're part of our histories. And one way of Africanizing transgender people, intersex people, non-gendered people, is to go to our history. I'm a Muganda from Buganda. We have a king. In the record, the colonial archives have written about royalty, monarchy. In Buganda, a man who had sex with young men, and he was arrested and exiled. The young men were martyred. Many of them are celebrated as martyrs today in the Catholic Church in Uganda. But this is part of our history. And this was before Donald Trump was born. So pre-Donald Trump, we have colonial and pre-colonial histories in the archives that talk about these people. We have our languages. My local language, Luganda, expresses or labels men and women, and also people who are chakura chisajja, chakura chikazi. And we have these names in our local languages, in our local vernaculars. Before I call them transgender, which trans-medicalizes alternative genders, we can look into our spirituality, in African spirituality. In the case of Buganda, which is a culture that I've studied as an anthropologist, they played roles where they were possessed by the spirits of ancestors of different genders. And they were mediums, spirit mediums, who had alternative genders. They were fluid in their gender. And so before we even talk about Donald Trump and his recourse back to biology, essentialist biology between just female and men, I think we can go back to our roots as Africans to see what were these, our languages that are non-gendered, where we don't have he or she pronouns. How did we refer to people? Yeah? And so in terms of definition, I think for me that it's important that we center gender definitions within our African ways of gendering people. And we have to go back to the pre-colonial and colonial archives, but also today in post-Trump Africa. There are new ways of expressing third gender, alternative gender, that are not he or she. How are modern day transgender people in Africa, in Morocco, in Tanzania, in Uganda, in Sierra Leone, in Ghana, how do they name themselves? And their languages there. Many of them below the radar, some of them on internet, some of them on Tinder and Gaydar, if you know what these are. If you don't know, you're falling behind the Gen Z lingua. Yeah? But there are ways in which African people who are in the margins, There are ways in which we call ourselves. Can we tap into that? And I think for me that the question then is not to say, I'm not saying that the law should not be there. Let the law do what it does. It has worked for majorities for a long time. But I'm saying let us not criminalize knowledge generation around those who are criminalized. Yeah? Or academic freedom for those of us who study those who are criminalized because of their gender. I wanted to talk a little bit about the question on gerontocracy because I think you raised the point from Sierra Leone, how seniors, people who are older, are among those who abuse the academic freedom and right to promotion of those who are younger. And I think it's a salient point because we are looking inward at the university where professors abuse their power, their seniority to take away from us. And we have to deal with that. The problem is many times those of us who face these challenges do not have the power, the resources, the clout to challenge these big boy clubs and the cliquism within the university, right? I think in terms of talking about power within, feminist methodologies tell us to look at ourselves before we look outward. That's a core point that you have to touch, and I think that some of us in this sitting are also very guilty. So thanks for pushing it and pointing it out. The examples from Mozambique, thank you very much. I think why I highlight those of us who are from countries that are criminalized is because we used to have the PhDs, BK, professor, we used to have these courses. I was teaching. I was at Makerere University, at Maiza, where people were studying queer African studies. I wrote a course to teach queer African studies. My professor wanted me to teach gender in history. Part of my problem with Professor Mamdani comes from him telling me, teach gender in history, and me saying, no, I have designed a study called Queer African Studies for PhDs. It had 13 course units. I couldn't do that because I didn't have his approval if I didn't call it gender in history. I'm not a historian. So what does it mean for me to want to supervise queer African-based PhDs, but have a professor who wants me to only supervise gender in history? So in Mozambique, I think these positive stories are encouraging, and comparative studies around queering academic freedom between Mozambique and South Africa would be relevant to compare with places like Uganda where it's no longer possible. I know PhDs who had to then transfer to South Africa because they can't do their work anymore in Uganda. So yes, they're good stories. I do not take away from that, but I want to deal with the criminalization because maybe nobody else can talk about this topic as brilliantly as I do. So the good stories are there, but I was focusing on the negative ones. And the last question, because I did not get the Portuguese question unless you ask it again, the last question is your question about my definition of academic freedom. So I think for me that the do no harm is important. We must ensure that our work, our research does no harm in terms of dissident politics from the margins, from below speaking up. We know that a lot of scientific research was done that harmed black bodies. The Tuskegee experiments that transferred syphilis to black bodies, the colonial anthropologists that were doing work for the administrator. I think he referred to anthropology that was done in those historical times. So the do no harm principle is important for me. Science and ethics. What are your methods? Be rigorous. What is the ethics of your work? Is it ethical? Has it been reviewed? Okay? And I think for me that if we meet those principles, I can allow to work with that. But to totally say, no, you can't even begin thinking about what is homosexuality in Uganda. What are the rights of homosexuals in Uganda? What is the law governing homosexuals in Uganda? How are homosexual people accessing ARVs? That we can't even begin to engage with the topic is not acceptable. So I think for me that academic research, even the definition in and of itself, if it's beyond doing no harm, must be interrogated. And part of what we do as feminists is to push the boundaries of what's ethical. And I think we can also push the boundaries of academic freedom today as defined, so that it includes voices from the margins who are marginalized by the normative definition. And I think that academic freedom is going to be a definition in progress. It's organic. It can't be set forever. It's going to be a debate. It must be a debate. And I think that its boundaries will keep being pushed and pulled. That's my definition. Sorry, I don't know the Portuguese and I didn't get the translation, but maybe we can converse during dinner. I don't know what language we'll converse in though. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And the issue of language is also a gender issue. We'll talk about it next time. Prof. Yusra, please.
Thank you. I will start with the question of my brother from Sierra Leone. So you asked me about how I tackled the censorship. It wasn't me, actually. It was one of my interviewees. I asked her this question about censorship. What was her experience with censorship or self-censorship? So she said, it was my supervisor who censored me because she didn't allow me to work on certain topics that she considers as sensitive topics. So, and she didn't work on this topic. She wanted to. It was on political elections in Morocco, in a specific area, in a specific region in Morocco. And she was mentioning that because there is this internalization of this censorship, this restriction. So supervisors or professors, they will use it as a mechanism of defense or as a protection as well. So she said that my supervisor was thinking that she's protecting me. And she ended up not working on what she wanted to work on. So the question on difference between STEM and humanities when it comes to academic freedom. It's interesting because I asked this question on perception because because when you ask someone in social sciences, a female scholar in social sciences about academic freedom, the response is a kind of natural. We don't have academic freedom in Morocco. But when I asked the same question to someone from STEM, so it was academic freedom was related to the protection of the secrets of the patent, the innovation. This is how the academic freedom is dealing with this. It's not a threat concerning the state. You're not a threat for the state, but you have to protect your innovation, your patent. This is how they deal with, or how they perceive academic freedom in STEM. So concerning your question on fieldwork and ethnography, it's interesting because when I studied in the Moroccan Public University, and I teach in a public university as well. And I have been doing participant observation for years in public universities, now as a professor. And I can tell you that I can't do it. Like I can go to a laboratory and say I work on academic freedom and I need to speak. They won't accept to talk to me about this topic. But from my position now, I can tell you that when we teach, sometimes professors they share with me that, even myself, we have to pay attention to what we say, because sometimes, especially when you do those lessons, your courses in amphitheaters, we don't know who is with us when we do the lessons. So we have to pay attention to what we say. So so there is this is why we speak about self-censorship. It's something that is embedded, in our cultural dynamic, cultural university, the dynamic of our university. So it won't be possible to be in a laboratory and speak about academic freedom. Some of the professors, they accept to talk to me, because there is a kind of, because they're my colleagues, or there is a kind of friendship, so they accepted to speak about this and say that there is no academic freedom, or give some examples. For example, some of the professors said, when she's teaching economics. And she mentioned that, for example, there is this chapter on the la loi des finances, like the law of finance law. And she said there is this chapter on the military budget. We usually I don't talk about these things because she said, because I don't know who is in the amphitheater. At the same time, I care also about social appeasement. We don't want any trouble. So you see, so these are the dynamics actually within universities, public universities in Morocco. Yeah, and there is also the question on yes, the social Morocco is cosmopolitan country, and you said, does it influence academic freedom? Yes. I will say yes and no, because I think yes. Yes, because there is a kind of openness when it comes to some cultural debate in some cultural, even within academia. We can do research on sexuality, sexual orientations. Scholars can research these topics in Morocco, but at the same time, this cosmopolitan social life, we don't have it within academia. So it's a very closed space, because it's a closed space because even research that is done in Morocco, in public universities, is very centered on Morocco and research on Moroccan topics. Yes, thank you. And the question, I didn't get the translation in Portuguese.
Maybe my brother from Luxophone, you can. I give you 1 or 2 seconds to ask your questions. You have the right, so maybe you can listen to the question. It is his right to get responses. So are they working now? So you can ask a question, and that will be the last one because time is not with us. Welcome.
Thank you so much again. I'll go slowly just for them to understand very well my question. The first, the professor, I asked, she told about academic freedom is a practice. So I just want to know if this practice is inside or outside of the institution. Hey, as a researcher and a professor, so what do you understand as academic freedom if it's a practice? And if it's a practice, since when, if this practice, my problem is to understand how this practice is exercised inside or outside the school, the academic freedom. And about the Professor Dr. Stella, she talked about the academic freedom, and she said about the gender aspect. And I was asking about the statistical about the academic freedom. If this freedom is more in the feminine class, or you observe this situation also in the opposite gender, that's masculine gender. Just to be brief, thank you.
Yes. So academic freedom as practice inside or outside the academic space? Okay. So it is a practice outside of the academic space, and also a practice and negotiation, but outside of the academic space, outside of the university. We, outside of the university, as I mentioned before, I just lost my idea, the idea I want to share. Yes, it's a practice outside of university because, yes, actually it is, there is no, even in terms of research, in public universities, there is no collective research. So all the efforts within, when it comes to research, they're outside of the space and individual efforts. So even when it comes to this academic freedom as a practice, so researchers and professors, they, as I mentioned before, so they publish in a different language that doesn't have a direct impact on, you know, on the public, on the audiences, and also they try to find other spaces which are not academic. It might be within militancy, journalism, creating networks, you know, outside of academia, but it's never happening within the university, the public university. It's never happening within it.
Thank you so much. Dr. Stella?
Right, so I'll try. Is it more about men or women, right? And I think for me, in terms of academic freedom to study queer people or homosexuals or transgender people, I don't have the statistics in Uganda, but the Ugandan general picture I have based on my anthropological study is even beyond gender, the variables that affect attitudes towards freedom are religion. Some very conservative religions make it sinful and sin to associate with homosexuality. So people who are conservative and religious are less likely to study homosexuality, but also class and generation and ethnicity. So some ethnic groups are more open because in our histories, it's there. Prior to colonization, we had homosexual people, so we want to study about these people who are part of our pre-colonial being as communities. I think in terms of generation, that much younger people are more open, even beyond the question of gender, that generation-wise, many of the more conservative age groups are the older people than the younger ones. But these are my general impressions based on ethnography. And maybe the last thing is around patriotism, that people who are pro-government are very patriotic and often anti-homosexuality, anti-transgender, anti-this, anti-that. And that generally people who are in the opposition and critical of the government and government positions tend to be more open. But again, these are stereotypes and generalizations not based on quantitative research. It's me giving my anthropological look in without counting anybody or anyone. Yeah. So I think it's much more than just gender. It's a very intersectional question that must be studied. Somebody has to fund the research and we do the statistics. But in Uganda, I don't think you'll be allowed because it's still criminalized to study this. Maybe in other countries, before you get the criminalization coming into your countries, you can do the statistics. In Uganda, as far as I know, big K, it's still criminalized, right? Yeah, we can't do the work now. Thank you for being a wonderful moderator.
Thank you so much for also being wonderful panelists. Thank you so much for your time. A round of applause for my panelists. Yeah. Thank you so much. This is the end of this panel. And I'll hand over the microphone to the organizers. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Another round of applause for the gender team. They didn't cause, or they at least they made us awake. They didn't keep us sleeping, because They made the topic very interesting and speak to some critical issues that we face. So before we go, please, there's an issue that is very important that I want to bring to our attention. Yesterday, we know how some of you were moved away from Turmeric to a different hotel. And that wasn't the arrangement we made with the hotel. So I raised concerns with them, and they said today they will move those who were in the answers we got are very stimulating. So in my opinion, it sets the stage for our presentations tomorrow. So as I explained to you how the format is going to be tomorrow, I need not repeat it. So we get here at 9, we go into our breakout rooms. So tomorrow we are not coming here, we'll go into the classroom, some on the left, some on the right, and then some also upstairs. And so that's where we'll be doing our discussions. We have rapporteurs who will be there to scribble for us. So what we need to do is to appoint somebody as a moderator, and then the discussions will flow. You do all your presentations, and then there's extra room. You do general discussions, and then you prepare for the plenary. And then let's prepare for our welcome dinner this evening at 7 o'clock. We have a little bit of time to go and freshen up, and then we'll all be at Turmeric.